Sir Charles, the round mound of rebound. Charles Barkley was one of the dominant greats of the game. He was a perennial all-star in the late 80s and up to the late 90s, and although some of us, like myself, remember Charles for all of his greatness on the basketball court, many young NBA fans best know Chuck as a hilarious TV personality. He's currently working as an NBA analyst for Turner Sports and is always sure to provide raw and straight shooting opinions. With his fame crossing over into the world of NBA analysis, I think many have forgotten or just have never known how great of an NBA legend Charles Barkley actually was. Today, we're delving into the career of one of my favorite players from my childhood, and hopefully, we leave this video with a greater respect for one of the greatest to ever play. Charles Barkley was somewhat of an astonishing anomaly of the NBA. He was an undersized power forward, standing at only 6 foot 6 inches tall, yet he still dominated the position with his quickness, physicality, and punishing build. Despite the fact that Sir Charles was only 6'6", he still dominated the boards and solidified his legacy as one of the greatest rebounders in NBA history, averaging 11.7 boards per game over the course of his career. Charles was one of the most efficient scorers in NBA history as well, which is quite a remarkable achievement, especially when you consider the fact that he was usually a few inches shorter than the power forward who was guarding him. Despite his lack of length, Charles still often scored at will, as he averaged 22.1 points per game over the course of his career and is currently 26th all-time on the NBA's all-time scoring list. The most incredible part about Chuck's scoring ability wasn't simply just the scoring, but the manner in which he scored his points. Like I mentioned, Charles was an unbelievably efficient scorer, as he shot an incredible 54.1% for his career. So just how efficient is that? Well, out of the top 50 scorers on the all-time list, he's the most efficient non-center from the field in NBA history at 54.1%. If you include centers, he was third behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was 7'2" and had the most indefensible shot in NBA history, and behind his fellow analyst Shaquille O'Neal, who basically spent his entire career simply dunking the basketball. Sure, Chuck did his fair share of dunking as well, but he also did a lot of damage throughout his career from mid-range and even occasionally from three-point range. Charles' dominance didn't just affect the NBA in terms of wins and losses, but his dominance actually changed the way the game is played. Thanks to Chuck's ability to use his strength and back down the opponent, the NBA created the back-to-the-basket rule. Now, for any player located below the free throw line, he could no longer back down a player with his back to the basket for as long as 5 seconds, which was something Charles did decently often in his games before the rule was put into effect. Despite his world-class scoring, rebounding, efficiency, and the ways he changed the game, Charles was still unable to claim that elusive NBA championship. When you add all of this up, you have a legitimate argument for the title of NBA's greatest player of all time to never win a championship. Obviously, guys like Karl Malone, John Stockton, Allen Iverson, and Elgin Baylor have their own case for that title, but if you ask me, that title belongs to Sir Charles. I'll take the guy who is an all-around baller, who is an unstoppable scorer, a dominant rebounder, was a terrific passer for a power forward, he could run the fast break, and was the epitome of efficiency. Sure, Charles won only one MVP award in his career, and that was in the 1992-93 season, and although that season was impressive, that award was far more of an acknowledgement of his team's success that year because that season wasn't even one of the best seasons of his career. These are the impressive numbers from his 92-93 season, where he led his Phoenix Suns to a 62-20 season and eventually a trip to the NBA Finals. Although these MVP stats are incredibly impressive, when you compare them to the numbers from his previous seasons, you begin to see how Charles could have been winning MVP awards year after year during his prime. Notice particularly his remarkable efficiency compared to his MVP season. During Barkley's prime, he was shooting just about 60% from the field every year. That is unheard of, especially of a player of his size. One final thing I want to address to really emphasize the greatness of Charles Barkley and explain why he was as great as he was, yet didn't have all the championship success that many other greats had. When Charles was in his prime, he never played beside a legitimate superstar. When he had just begun to break out as an NBA superstar, his teammate Julius Erving was in his late 30s and was nowhere close to the superstar he once was. By the time Charles Barkley actually played with a legitimate superstar in Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles was in his mid-30s and in the twilight of his career. At that point, Charles was averaging under 20 points per game and under 50% field goal percentage. Again, during Barkley's prime, he played with good role players and all-stars like Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, and Maurice Cheeks, but never did he play with a legitimate franchise player, which brings me to my next point. Listen, I love you, Shaq, but you need to stop heckling Charles for his lack of rings compared to your championship rings. You had a young Kobe Bryant who coincided nicely with the prime of your career. Kobe was an electrifying young superstar who could score at will and was also a lockdown defensive player. In 2 of Shaq's championships with the Lakers, Kobe was averaging near 30 points per game, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists, while being a lockdown defender and a clutch performer. No offense to you, Shaq, but you have this guy in Kobe Bryant who could win you Game 4 of the NBA Finals when you fouled out. Tell me, who's supposed to do that for Charles in the '93 Finals against Jordan's Bulls? Kevin Johnson or Dan Marley isn't taking over a game like Kobe Bryant can. What about Shaq's lone championship with Miami? Shaq wasn't even the best player on that team. It took a clutch series from Dwayne Wade where he literally carried his team on his back, averaging 34.7 points, 7.8 rebounds, 3.8 assists, and 2.7 steals in a dominating effort to beat the Mavericks in the '06 Finals. What if Barkley had that kind of support in the '93 Finals, or just in his playoff runs in general? What about Charles' competition at his own position? Karl Malone and Charles Barkley were often compared to one another for the title of best power forward in the NBA, and honestly, I always liked Charles in that argument, but unfortunately, Chuck didn't have the luxury of having arguably the greatest facilitator of all time as his point guard for just about his entire career. Listen, I loved Kevin Johnson of the Suns and Maurice Cheeks of the 76ers, but neither of them were John freaking Stockton. Charles Barkley was an absolute all-time great player, but he just didn't have the luxury of playing alongside other superstars while he was in his prime, like other greats have throughout the years. If that had been a luxury that Charles had been blessed with, you bet he would have the rings to show for it. Elgin Gay Baylor, the greatest Laker that almost no one talks about. He was a 6'5" small forward who played in the 60s and early 70s. His game possessed a combination of grace and power. He was a fantastic all-around player, but for several reasons, his legacy has been overlooked, and he doesn't get talked about among the greats nearly as much as he should be. By the end of this video, you may see that this guy was way better than you initially thought. So let's take it back to the beginning of his career and get into it. Baylor was drafted in 1958 with the first overall pick by the Minneapolis Lakers. He was an older rookie by NBA standards, but as a 24-year-old rookie, he put his skills on display, averaging 24.9 points, 15 rebounds, and 4.1 assists on 41% shooting. It was good enough to win the Rookie of the Year award. These numbers are extremely impressive, and I understand that stats are somewhat inflated in the early NBA as they are today, and that might have something to do with Baylor's high rebound numbers, but it's definitely not the whole story. Baylor knew how to use his body and athleticism to dominate the boards, despite the fact that he was just a 6'5" small forward. He ranked 3rd overall in rebounds in his rookie season, and every other player in the top 7 in rebounding that year was at the center position and significantly taller than Baylor. Elgin said that upon entering the NBA that his goal was to average 20 rebounds a game over the course of a season. In his 3rd season in the league, he averaged 19.8 rebounds, and the following year he averaged 18.6. For his career, he averaged 13.5 rebounds as a 6'5" small forward. When it came to getting rebounds, he was essentially Dennis Rodman before Dennis Rodman, except Rodman wasn't a 30 points a night kind of guy like Baylor was. Elgin was one of the greatest scorers the NBA has ever seen. He was a strong player who was fantastic with his back to the basket, and he was tremendous at finishing in the paint. Baylor was also known for his hang time and would often wait out his opponent in the air before he released his shot. Many who witnessed Baylor play, and even the greats who played with him, have described him as Dr. J before Dr. J, Jordan before Jordan, and Kobe before Kobe. The stats back it up too. As I mentioned earlier, in his first year he averaged 24.9 points, and then he averaged 29.6 in his second year and 34.8 in his third year. By his fourth year in the league, he had become the most dominant wing in the NBA, averaging video game numbers of 38.3 points, 18.6 rebounds, and 4.6 assists on 43% shooting. Through his career, 18 times he scored 50 or more points. That's the fifth most in NBA history. That's more than Iverson, Durant, LeBron, Gervin, and many other scorers of the NBA's rich past. Among those 50-point games was a contest in 1960 against the New York Knicks, where he torched them for 71 points and 25 rebounds on 58% shooting. At the time, this was the highest scoring performance in NBA history. In fact, for a while, he held the record for most points in a game, in a playoff game, and in a single half. I remember when Kobe was tearing it up in the mid-2000s, and every time he set some kind of scoring record, they would always say, "No one has done this since Elgin Baylor did it." Not Wilt, not Kareem, not Shaq, Elgin Baylor. He has the third highest career points per game average of all time. Only Wilt and Jordan are ahead of him on that list. When analysts talk about the greatest scorers of all time, they usually talk about James Harden, Kobe Bryant, Kevin Durant, and LeBron James. Yet Elgin averaged more points for his career than all of those guys. Beyond that, he was also an 11-time All-Star and made 10 All-NBA teams. He was a great defensive player as well. Unfortunately, I can't prove it to you with numbers because steals and blocks were not accounted for during his playing days. They didn't even have all-defense teams, but he almost certainly would have made appearances if they did. He clearly sounds like one of the greatest ever, so that leads us to ask, why exactly is he so overlooked if he's truly that good? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. For one, he's a Los Angeles Laker, and the Lakers have the richest history of talent the NBA has seen. Not only that, but Laker lore is defined and remembered by one thing: championships, which is something that Baylor never got. Baylor was 0-8 in the finals. Now, although they did have some hard-fought 7-game series, it's not completely his fault that he never won a ring. For example, this was the era of the stacked Celtics dynasty, and because there was no free agency at this time, the Celtics were allowed to stay stacked during that entire era. Eventually, the Lakers acquired Wilt Chamberlain, and with Wilt, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor, the Lakers finally had the super team necessary to dethrone the Celtics. But this was towards the end of his career. In his final year, Baylor was 37 years old, and knee issues only allowed him to play 9 games before the injury essentially forced him into retirement. He missed out on 2 incredible accomplishments because of this. The first was the Lakers' 33-game winning streak, which is still an NBA record to this day. The second was the Lakers won the championship that season. Although he technically wasn't an active player during the championship, the Lakers organization still chose to give him an NBA championship ring. Missing out on those bits of history certainly affects his legacy and plays a part in why he's overlooked. The other reason why he's overlooked is because it's hard to get attention for averaging 38 points and 18 rebounds when Wilt Chamberlain is out there in Philadelphia averaging 50 points and 25 rebounds and scoring 100 points in a game. When people remember and talk about the 1962 NBA season, they don't talk about Baylor's impact, they talk about Wilt's dominance. Whether it's fair or not, the reality is Lakers lore and Wilt Chamberlain have both played a part in overshadowing Baylor's legacy. Regardless of all of this, the truth is Elgin Baylor is one of the greatest scorers ever. He's one of the greatest rebounders ever. He's one of the greatest, if not the greatest player to never win a championship. And he's one of the greatest Lakers ever. And yet somehow he's still rarely talked about. This is why, in my honest opinion, Elgin Baylor is the most underrated player of NBA history. For more than 2/3 of my life, I've had the luxury of watching this man play basketball. Half man, half amazing, Vince Carter was the person who put Toronto basketball on the map and helped define an era of incredible NBA legends. Let's start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Vince was selected with the 5th overall pick in the 1998 NBA draft by the Golden State Warriors, before they traded him that same evening to the Toronto Raptors for fellow rookie Anton Jamison. Vince makes his debut, and immediately, fans around the world were taking note of his incredible leaping ability, flair, and athleticism. Shortly after that, a league and media hungry and desperate for a new face of the league start making all the Michael Jordan comparisons. Vince had many skills offensively, and it led him to an impressive rookie campaign as he averaged 18.3 points, 5.7 rebounds, 3 assists, 1.1 steals, and 1.5 blocks on 45% shooting. Good enough to be that season's Rookie of the Year winner, ahead of the likes of Paul Pierce, Dirk Nowitzki, and Antawn Jamison. Regardless of his solid first season, the still young Raptors franchise were yet to make their first playoff berth. But that would soon change as Vince was heading into his breakout season. As a 23-year-old in only his second year in the league, he played all 82 games and put up numbers of 25.7 points, 5.8 rebounds, 3.9 assists, 1.3 steals, and 1.1 blocks on 46.5% shooting. He also shot an extremely impressive 40.3% from three-point range. Midway through the season, Vince put on possibly the most iconic dunk contest performance in league history, a key factor in why he's widely considered the greatest dunker the NBA has ever seen. With Carter leading the way, Toronto made it to the playoffs with a 45-37 record before they were eliminated by the New York Knicks. At the time, there were plenty of reasons to be optimistic about the future of this team, and it appeared as if they would soon be perennial contenders in the Eastern Conference. But in that offseason, much of that promise was ruined as Tracy McGrady departed for the Orlando Magic, a move that McGrady has since said that he regrets making. On top of that, Kobe Bryant said just a couple years ago that if Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady would have stuck together, they would have won championships. That's a pretty remarkable comment for Kobe to make, considering the fact that those seasons from Carter and McGrady would have overlapped with the years Kobe and Shaq won their first 3 titles. With McGrady gone, Carter would have to lead the Raptors on his own, but before he would do that, he would have to lead his country in the Olympic Games. And that's where this famously happened. Again, another aspect of why I see him as the greatest NBA dunker of all time. As amazing and as iconic as this single dunk was, it's easy to overlook that this was just one play of a heroic summer from Carter. Team USA won the gold this year, and the very next time they would be in the Olympics, they would fall short. One of the major differences between the winning USA team and the losing USA team was the fact that Carter was only on the winning squad. On their way to the gold, Vince led the team in minutes played, he was second in three-pointers made, and he was by far the team's leading scorer with an entire 4-point average ahead of second place, who was Kevin Garnett. Freshly off of his awesome Olympian performance, Vince was ready to get back at it with the Raptors, and he continued to dominate. In his third year, Vince had possibly his best season, averaging 27.6 points, 5.5 rebounds, 3.9 assists, 1.5 steals, and 1.1 blocks on 46% shooting from the field and 40.8% from three-point range. This led the Toronto Raptors to have their best record in franchise history, finishing at 47-35, but Carter and the Raptors were not done yet. In the first round of the playoffs, they were in a best-of-5 series with the New York Knicks, and after 5 hard-fought games, the Raptors were moving on to the second round. The 2001 Eastern Conference semifinals would be a 7-game matchup between Carter and the Raptors and the MVP Allen Iverson and his 76ers. This would be one of the greatest playoff series of all time, as both superstars were leading their teams with epic individual performances. Carter's best outing was in Game 3, and it was arguably one of the greatest playoff performances of all time. He was hitting basically everything, as he poured in 50 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds, and 4 blocks on 65% shooting. He also made 9 of his 13 three-point shots, which is a remarkable 69%. At the time, his 9 three-pointers was the NBA record for the most three-point shots ever made in a playoff game. Unsurprisingly, the Raptors blew out the Sixers that game. Over the 7-game series, Carter averaged 30.4 points, 6 rebounds, 5.6 assists, 1.9 steals, and 2 blocks on 47.4% shooting. With Vince and Iverson continuing their elite play, it all led up to the final moment of Game 7. 2 seconds left, ball being inbounded by the Raptors, and they're down by 1 point. The crazy thing is, this situation was just like the one last year with Kawhi Leonard's epic last shot. Eastern Conference semifinals between the Raptors and 76ers, Game 7, and it all comes down to the final shot. The only difference is Kawhi made his shot. Carter did not. At the time, it was shocking that Vince missed it, considering he was so good up to that point and was consistently one of the best clutch moment shooters in the game. More on that later. Instead, Iverson went on to have iconic moments in the NBA Finals against Shaq and Kobe, and if that jumper by Carter had simply gone in, that could have been his Raptors in the finals instead. It's my firm belief that this 24-year-old version of Vince Carter was the best we would ever see from him, because starting the following year, he would continue to suffer from nagging knee and ankle injuries and even started building a reputation of being a brittle player. In the next 2 seasons, the injuries caused him to miss 61 games, which also included surgery in the 2002 offseason. By the 04-05 season, the Raptors' days of making the playoffs were long behind them, and the organization traded a frustrated Vince to the New Jersey Nets. Many people don't remember Carter's legacy for his days in New Jersey, but the truth is he was still very elite for several years there. He was an all-star in his first 3 years with the Nets, as he averaged 25.5 points and 45% shooting over that time. Alongside of Richard Jefferson and Jason Kidd, the Nets made it as far as the semifinals for those first few seasons. For one reason or another, they were never able to break through the Eastern Conference, and by the summer of 2009, he was traded again, this time to the Orlando Magic. Carter was quickly approaching his mid-30s at this point, and as he was declining, the latter half of his career turned into the journeys of a solid role player, as he also played for the Suns, Mavericks, Grizzlies, Kings, and Hawks. Later into his career, his athleticism wasn't what it once was, but he was relied upon more for his leadership and his solid three-point shooting. Very few players have been an elite superstar at one point in their career and then successfully adapted into a solid role player later in their career. For example, Kobe Bryant scoffed at the notion of exiting the NBA averaging only 10 points a game. Allen Iverson was insulted at the suggestion of a former MVP winner coming off the bench. Carmelo Anthony basically kept himself out of the league for a couple years because he refused to accept a reduced role. But then you have a guy like Vince Carter, a guy who let go of his ego and simply wanted to contribute and play the game he loved as long as physically possible. In his own way, that is extremely honorable. Looking at the totality of his career, Vince was an 8-time All-Star and made 2 All-NBA teams. This is a very subjective argument, but if I did a poll, I think most people would agree that Vince Carter is the greatest dunker in NBA history. It's not just his iconic dunk performance in 2000, but it was also the fact that he may be the greatest in-game dunker of all time. He famously jumped over a 7-footer in the Olympics, he ruthlessly destroyed great shot blockers like Alonzo Mourning and Dikembe Mutombo, and he's even been windmill dunking at the age of 42. Having the title of greatest dunker ever is impressive enough in itself, but let's understand, he was so much more than just that. He was a legitimate all-around superstar who could have won championships if circumstances had played out just slightly differently. He's one of the greatest three-point shooters of NBA history, and sneakily, he's one of the most clutch shooters the game has ever seen. Vince has an incredible 16 game-winning shots over the course of his career. When the clock was running down, there were very few players who you would rather have with the ball in their hands. There's no official all-time list for game-winning shots, because there's a lot of variables in how we define what a game-winning shot is. But, of all the unofficial lists I could find around the web, Carter was usually in or around the top 5.
Clyde the Glide Drexler, one of the great perimeter players of the late 80s and early 90s. This guy has been one of the most requested videos from my viewers, and the main reason is because the older generation, who actually witnessed him play, seem to think he was a greater player than the people who have simply heard of him. So in this case, how good was Clyde Drexler really, is a very legitimate question. Today we'll be evaluating his career, talent, and legacy starting from the beginning of his NBA days. Clyde Drexler was selected with the 14th overall pick in the 1983 draft by the Portland Trail Blazers. His talent was recognized, but few saw his actual superstar potential, and that in large part is why he wasn't a top 10 pick. Clyde was a lengthy 6'7" shooting guard with incredible athleticism and leaping ability who had a tendency for attacking and finishing around the rim. As his career progressed, he also became a solid three-point shooter. With that being said, his career got off to a slow start. In his rookie campaign, he was coming off the bench playing only 17 minutes a game, averaging 7.7 points, 2.9 rebounds, and 1.9 assists on 45.1% shooting. The Blazers finished off that year with a 48-34 record before they were eliminated in the first round in 5 games to the Phoenix Suns. Drexler hadn't given the Portland organization much reason yet to be committed to him, which brings us to the 1984 NBA Draft. The Blazers were desperate for a legitimate center, which at the time was seen as something that's very necessary for a team to have in order to compete for championships. The Blazers, being not yet overly impressed by Drexler, offered the 2nd overall pick and Drexler to the Houston Rockets for their superstar big man, Ralph Sampson. The Rockets already had the 1st overall pick, meaning that if this trade went through, they would have had the first pick, the second pick, and Clyde Drexler, and in all likelihood, they would have taken Hakeem Olajuwon first and Michael Jordan second, forming what would have been the greatest big three of all time. The Rockets thought about it and ultimately decided not to accept the trade, which they'll regret for the rest of eternity. The reason I mention this is because it's a key aspect to Drexler's legacy. If the trade had gone through, he certainly would have won more in the long run, but he also would have been relegated to a third option, and we probably wouldn't look back on him as an alpha superstar. The Blazers instead passed up on Jordan and took Sam Bowie second overall as the center they hoped would dominate moving forward. Sadly, he would have numerous injuries, turned out to be a bust, and was not at all the help that Drexler would need moving forward. Despite the missed opportunities, Drexler improved his game and stats across the board, and his team would advance further as a result. In that sophomore year, he averaged 17.2 points, 6 rebounds, 5.5 assists, and 2.2 steals on 49.4% shooting. His Blazers made it to the second round before being eliminated in 5 games by the eventual champion Los Angeles Lakers. He would continue to slowly improve over time, but it wasn't until his 5th year in the league that he reached his full potential as an elite star, as he averaged 27 points, 6.6 rebounds, and 5.8 assists on 50.6% shooting. These fantastic numbers may represent Drexler's best season, but it was only good enough to make him the second best shooting guard in the league. And honestly, that's the issue that made him so underappreciated, was his timing. It's hard to give Drexler much attention for putting up 27, 6, and 6 when Jordan is simultaneously putting up 35, 8, and 8 from the same position while being the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year. Clyde Drexler isn't appreciated enough by fans today, but the sad truth is, he wasn't even fully appreciated when he was in his prime. From 1988 to 1992, Clyde continued his steady production in his best 5-year stretch of his career from a statistical standpoint, putting up 24.8 points, 6.9 rebounds, 6 assists, 2.2 steals on 49% shooting. His Blazers also made the NBA Finals twice in that 5-year run. The first time came in the 1990 season, where they eventually lost in 5 games to the repeat champion Detroit Pistons, but it certainly wasn't Drexler's fault that they couldn't get it done, because he was a monster in that series, scoring 26.4 points, 7.8 rebounds, and 6.2 assists on 54.3% shooting. The second time came in 1992 when they pushed Jordan's Bulls to 6 games. Unfortunately, this would be the last time that Clyde's Blazers would seriously contend for a title, and after his team would continue to decline for a few more years, Drexler had had enough and had asked for a trade midway through the 1994-95 season. His request was granted, and he was traded to the defending champion yet struggling Houston Rockets. The Rockets were entering those playoffs as an underdog 6th-seeded team. Hakeem Olajuwon was clearly the best player throughout the playoffs, but that season he couldn't have done it without Drexler, who was huge throughout the playoffs, particularly in the first round against the Jazz, where he averaged 25, 7, and 5 on 58% shooting, and in the finals against the Magic, where he averaged nearly 22, 10, and 7 on 45% shooting. Those next few seasons with Houston would be his last, but by the end of his career, he was a former MVP candidate, an NBA champion, a 10-time All-Star, an Olympic gold medalist with the '92 Dream Team, and he was selected in 1996 as one of the 50 greatest players of all time. Very rarely do you hear people praise Clyde for his defense, but he was certainly more than capable, and with his quick hands and instincts, he was often among the league leaders in steals per game. Simply put, he was a winner, a big game performer, and one of the greatest and most underappreciated shooting guards who's ever played the game. When it comes to the great centers of NBA history, there are a famous few who hog all of the shine and attention to themselves. For example, the Shaq, Chamberlain, and Hakeems of the world, just to name a few. But then you have a guy like Patrick Ewing, who was a dominant force on both ends of the court, carried his franchise for years, and who ranks high on many of the NBA's all-time statistical lists. Unfortunately, Ewing is one of those legends that never won an NBA championship, and whether it's fair or not, by and large, that's the greatest determining factor in how we separate the icons from simply the great players. Today we're evaluating the talent, nuances, and legacy of a Knicks legend that I'm sure their fans miss very dearly.
Patrick was drafted in 1985 with the first overall pick by the New York Knicks. When Ewing was entering the NBA, he was 23 years old and was coming off of an extremely successful 4 years with Georgetown University. Ewing was a 7-foot center with a near 8-foot long wingspan. He was a force when attacking the rim, he was skilled with low post moves, and with his reach and athleticism, he was an elite shot blocker. There wasn't anything necessarily flashy about his game, but he was smooth, consistent, and methodical. His rookie year was plagued with injuries, causing him to miss 32 games of his first season. Other than the games he missed, his rookie campaign was quite solid, as he averaged 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 2.1 blocks on 47.4% shooting. With this being said, Patrick and his Knicks were still far from contending in a tough, top-heavy Eastern Conference. After his debut season, his game would slowly continue to improve over time, as would his team's ability to contend. It wasn't until his 4th year in the league that his Knicks finally began to break through, as they finished the 88 and 89 season with a 52 and 30 record. Ewing spearheaded this surge, as he averaged 22.7 points, 9.3 rebounds, and 3.5 blocks on a career-best 56.7% shooting. These Knicks would eventually be eliminated in the semifinals by Jordan's Chicago Bulls. But this was merely a taste of what the Knicks were capable of. As I mentioned earlier, Ewing and the Knicks never won a championship, but it is important to keep in mind that over the next 5 years, from 1990 to 1994, the Knicks were eliminated each year by the eventual NBA champions. The Pistons in 90, the Bulls in 91, 92, and 93, and to the Rockets in 94. Ewing and the Knicks were certainly of elite caliber, they just could never quite make it over the hump. These 5 seasons encompass the prime of Ewing's career, as he averaged 25.6 points, 11.3 rebounds, and 3 blocks on 51.8% shooting during that stretch. Within these years of contending were many ups and downs for Ewing. Due to his shortcomings in the playoffs, many labeled him a choker, like in the 1995 East semifinals when Ewing blew a layup that would have sent Game 7 to overtime, or like the 1994 NBA Finals when Ewing shot under 40% for the series and was greatly outplayed by Hakeem Olajuwon. But let's be honest, what center in the 90s did not get embarrassed by Hakeem Olajuwon? Despite a few crucial instances where Patrick underperformed, there were also times where he came up huge, like in Game 6 of the 1992 Eastern Conference semifinals against the Bulls, where the Knicks were facing elimination and Ewing was dealing with a severe ankle sprain, yet Ewing still scored 27 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 blocks in a Willis Reed-type performance to secure the victory. The truth is, Ewing is somewhere in the middle, like most players. He had moments where he came up small in the playoffs, and he had moments where he came up clutch. The difference in how you're remembered is usually defined by whether or not you won championships. And unfortunately, due to Jordan and Olajuwon and ongoing knee issues, he was never able to secure that ring. His Knicks were able to make it to another NBA Finals in 1999, but at that point, he was 36 years old and wasn't the player he once was. He played 17 years in the NBA in total and had career averages of 21 points, 9.8 rebounds, and 2.4 blocks on 50.4% shooting. For his career, he was an 11-time All-Star, made 7 All-NBA teams, and 3 All-Defense teams. The numbers and talent tell us that he's one of the greatest centers to ever live, but I honestly think the narratives about him have made him somewhat underrated. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments section how good you think Patrick Ewing is.
Julius the Dr. Erving, one of the all-time greats of NBA history, but just how great? Dr. J had an incredible flair and style to his game, reminiscent of the more recent Michael Jordan. He spent many of his prime years dominating a league that no longer exists, which was the ABA, before he eventually joined the Philadelphia 76ers upon the NBA's merger in 1976. When we reflect on the NBA's history, sometimes the Doctor gets overlooked, or at least doesn't get the credit he deserves, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that his best days were in the 70s and early 80s, before the game of basketball truly rose to its highest levels of popularity. So although that's understandable, we're certainly not going to let him get shortchanged on our watch. Let's take a deeper look into the greatness of Julius Erving. The 1971-72 season was Dr. J's rookie year for the Virginia Squires, and as a 21-year-old with his incredible athleticism, leaping ability, and skill at finishing around the rim, he was an MVP candidate immediately, averaging 27.3 points, 15.7 rebounds, and 4 assists on 50% from the field. He also played in all 84 games that season. He
He was an all-star upon entering the ABA and went on to be an all-star every single year of his career in both the ABA and the NBA. In his second season of the ABA, he continued his dominance, scoring nearly 32 points per game while pulling down over 12 boards a game. From that point on, he never looked back. Dr. J won the ABA MVP award for the next 3 seasons straight, and his New York Nets won the ABA championship 2 of those next 3 seasons. He also won the 1976 ABA dunk contest with one of the most iconic dunks of basketball history. For those of you who want to criticize older athletes of years past because of the perceived lack of athleticism, let's remember that Dr. J was dunking from the free throw line before Kobe Bryant and LeBron James were even born. Dr. J wrapped up his ABA career with a resume strong enough to definitively make him the greatest ABA player of all time. During his ABA career, he averaged 28.7 points, 12.1 rebounds, and 4.8 assists on 50.4% shooting. On top of all of that, consider the fact that Julius accomplished all of this before he turned 27 years old. Now, with that being said, I know what a lot of you guys are probably thinking. Yes, this was the ABA in the 1970s that we're talking about, a league with only 10 teams and a league that was represented by less than half of the world's best basketball talent. So it's important to take all of Dr. J's success in that league with a grain of salt. I get that. That's what made his leap into the NBA in 1976 so pivotal. With the fusion of the ABA and the NBA, the level of competition in the league grew, and we were able to see how that impacted Dr. J's numbers and his career overall, especially when you consider the fact that Dr. J was making this move right in the prime age of his career. If you take a close look at the career averages of Dr. J, you'll see that those averages did dip a bit upon his arrival to the NBA, but context is extremely necessary to understand the situation. In Irving's days in the ABA, he was the anchor of the team's success, and he was a workhorse who was ultimately the difference in whether or not his team won games. During his ABA career, Julius was averaging a giant load of over 40 minutes per game. When Dr. J joined the 76ers, he was joining an extremely talented 76ers roster that was expected to win a lot more games. Load management was in effect for the Doctor, and he played an average of 35 minutes per game for his career in the NBA. Naturally, a decrease of 5 minutes per game is going to decrease your points, rebounds, and assist averages. Another contributing factor was the fact that he was joining fellow superstar George McGinnis on the 76ers. George was a power forward who was actually the ABA MVP just 2 years prior, averaging nearly 30 points and 15 rebounds a game. George was an absolute monster on the boards over his career, so naturally, Dr. J and George decreased each other's averages by playing alongside one another. So with all of that being said, I think it's fair to say that Dr. J's numbers declining upon his arrival to the NBA had less to do with the level of competition increasing, and had more to do with less being required of him on a star-studded roster with decreased minutes. Over the next 7 years, Dr. J averaged 23.3 points, 7.4 rebounds, and 4.1 assists for the 76ers. Throughout that time, the 76ers were perennial NBA title contenders and had got extremely close to winning the championship multiple times. When George McGinnis was traded, Dr. J's numbers rose to his best season as a 76er, as he was needed more offensively and on the boards, as he averaged 27 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 52% shooting in only 36 minutes a game. The following season, he won the 1981 NBA MVP award, and the 76ers remained contenders. It wasn't until the 1982-83 season that the 76ers finally made the NBA their own. The 82-83 76ers are still considered one of the greatest teams in NBA history. It was their first year with a dominant big man in Moses Malone, and the tandem of Julius and Moses cruised through the NBA season on their way to a 65-17 record. In the playoffs, they went 12-1, which is tied for the fewest losses in NBA playoff history. During the dynasty days of the Lakers and Celtics of the 80s, these 1983 76ers were the only team to break through and interrupt their championship reign on the league. Moses Malone was definitely the best player on that Sixers team, but Dr. J definitely had a terrific impact and added to his already powerful legacy. So all in all, Dr. J had a marvelous career in both leagues. He was also a solid defender, I'm not going to make it sound like he was locking down people as if he was Scottie Pippen out there, but he was great at causing turnovers. For his career, he averaged 2 steals a game and a remarkable 1.7 blocks per game, which is extremely high for a 6'7" forward. He was not a great perimeter shooter, but he was all-time great athletically and was a terrific finisher who often dunked the ball when attacking the rim, but he also had an all-time great layup package. Dr. J doesn't have the benefit of accumulative statistics working in his favor on the all-time rankings. If ABA stats were factored into the NBA's all-time rankings, Dr. J would be the 8th leading scorer all-time, and he also would be second among small forwards behind only LeBron James. He was also extremely efficient while getting all of those buckets, shooting an impressive 50.6% over his career. Dr. J had it all. He was a pioneer of the game. He had the skills, the abilities, the accolades, and the championships. As far as where this puts him among the greatest small forwards of all time, I say LeBron and Bird are at the top, but third place, I've got to give it to the Doctor. I really think that he was that deserving and that he was that good. KD and Kawhi aren't quite on that level yet, but they're pretty close behind. Scottie Pippen and Elgin Baylor aren't too far off either. Enough of my opinions though. Let me know in the comments section where you think Julius Erving ranks among the greatest small forwards of all time.
Dwight David Howard. This 6'10" center remains as one of the most highly debated former All-Stars that the league has ever seen. Some believe he was overhyped and overrated, and some think he was one of the greatest centers of all time. When it comes to this player, there seems to be no happy medium, as everyone continues to take extreme stances on his talent and legacy. So where do I stand? Just how good was Dwight Howard really? As someone who witnessed the various stages of his career, I'll do my best to answer that, but as usual with this series, let's take it back to the very beginning of his career. In 2004, Dwight Howard was selected with the first overall pick in the NBA draft by the Orlando Magic. He was a hyped prospect who decided to skip college and go directly to the NBA thanks to the influence of his childhood role model, Kevin Garnett. Many of the players who entered the NBA directly out of high school often struggled to have a productive impact in their first couple seasons in the league. But this wasn't the case for Howard. Even as a 19-year-old, he already had a stronger and more athletic basketball body than most of the players in the league at that time. The Magic team that he joined only won 21 games before the arrival of Howard, and in his rookie season, he helped improve the team by 15 wins. In his rookie year, he put up 12 points, 10 rebounds, and 1.7 blocks on 52% shooting. Sure, that might sound tame relatively, but you have to remember the context that this was a player straight out of high school. In that rookie campaign, Dwight became the youngest player to ever average a double-double, and he also became the youngest player to have averaged at least 10 rebounds in a season. But obviously, that's not the best we'd see from Howard. Over the next few years, his abilities would continue to improve, as he developed into arguably the best combination of power and athleticism in the NBA at that time. By the 2008 to 2009 season, Howard had officially reached his prime, as he was scoring 20 points, snagging 14 rebounds, and 3 blocks on 57% shooting. He was a league-leading rebounder, getting at least 20 rebounds 10 times throughout the regular season. But his greatest gift was likely his all-time great rim protection, as Howard's tremendous quickness and leaping ability allowed him to swat plenty of shots that would have been out of reach for most centers. For this year-long effort, he was rewarded as the 2009 Defensive Player of the Year, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few seasons, Howard would continue to put up similar averages. From 2009 to 2011, he won the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year, and that 3-season streak is the longest DPOY streak in NBA history. The crazy thing is that many people believe that he should have won the award for a 4th straight season, but voter fatigue was likely a factor in why they gave the award to Tyson Chandler instead of Dwight Howard. But make no mistake, Howard had more blocks, more steals, more defensive rebounds, more defensive win shares, and a better defensive plus-minus. Regardless of the amount of awards he ended up winning,
you can't really debate the fact that Howard was easily the best defensive player for an era of NBA basketball. From 2008 to 2013, Howard won a whopping 5 rebounding titles in a span of 6 years, as he was clearly the best rebounder in the game. Now here's the thing. With all of his dominance and multiple aspects, some people might start to think that Howard was a player without weakness, and arguably the best player in the game overall. Well, I would argue that he could have been, if it wasn't for one glaring weakness. Dwight was not a great scorer overall, and he was a bit limited with his post moves. The best way to defend Howard was to keep him outside of the paint, and keep his back to the basket. He wasn't a good jump shooter, he didn't have very good dribbling skills, and he really could have benefited from a better jump hook shot. These were the frequent criticisms during his career, and those critiques were not because people thought Howard was a bad player, but it was because people believed he had the potential to be the best player in the game if he expanded his scoring capabilities. Some of you might look at Howard's stats and think that these offensive criticisms are not legitimate. For example, in 2010, Howard averaged 18 points per game while leading the league in field goal percentage, hitting 61.2% of his shots. The thing is, Howard was very selective with his shooting, as he looked to score most often with his putback dunks and in pick and roll plays. But he wasn't very good at making a play for himself out of isolation situations. This is why he wasn't always aggressive on offense, and in the 2010 season, he only attempted 10.2 shots per game. LeBron, Kobe, Durant, Carmelo Anthony, and Monte Ellis all nearly attempted twice as many shots per game. Although Howard was recognized as a top 10 or even a top 5 player, he was 76th overall in total field goal attempts over the 2010 season. Even role players like Carl Landry and Corey Brewer shot the ball nearly 100 more times than Howard did over the course of the season, which really puts the criticism into perspective. So maybe he wasn't the stereotypical championship leader, but at least in the right situation, Howard could find himself on a roster where he was competing for a title as the best player on his team. He found himself in that situation in the 2009 postseason. Surrounding Dwight was an array of lethal three-point shooters who were able to alleviate most of the offensive load. Shooters like Rashard Lewis, Hedo Turkoglu, and JJ Redick. Add in 2 solid rotating point guards in Jameer Nelson and Rafer Alston, and it starts to make sense why this team that perfectly complemented each other made it all the way to the NBA Finals. At that point, they were clearly outgunned by the better Lakers team, as the Orlando Magic were defeated in just 5 games, and that was the closest a prime Dwight Howard would ever get to leading his team to a championship. So if I had to summarize what kind of player Dwight Howard was on the Orlando Magic, I would describe him as the player who had the talent and potential to be one of the select few greatest players of all time. But the execution limited him to being at best a top 5 player in the NBA during his prime. From an individual perspective, the 2012 to 2013 season was when Dwight's career started to head south. The Lakers shook the basketball world when they traded their championship-winning center, Andrew Bynum, for the 27-year-old superstar, Dwight Howard. The thing is, the Lakers thought they were getting an all-time great center just as he was hitting the prime of his career. But the truth is, they got him right as he was beginning his decline. You see, leading up to that offseason, Howard had major off-season back surgery, and from that point on, he never really regained his insane explosiveness from his more youthful days in Orlando. He remained a solid defender and a top rebounder for a while, but it was obvious that he lost a few steps on the athletic front. That Lakers season ended in disaster as Kobe Bryant tore his Achilles at the age of 34, and Dwight Howard ultimately decided to leave in free agency. With this, a new chapter of Dwight's career had begun, one where he had turned into a journeyman and was perceived by many as a drama queen and a locker room cancer. With that being said, Dwight remained a statistically reliable double-double player for 5 years after he left Los Angeles. At a certain point, the perception of Howard began to change, right about the same time that the expectations for him began to change. Once people started to accept that he would never be the championship leader that they thought he was capable of, and instead could embrace a role as simply a contributing complementary player on a contending team, people started to view him as a desirable player in the league. After short stints in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Washington, Dwight found his way back to Los Angeles, signing with the team in 2019. With leading stars like LeBron James and Anthony Davis on the roster, a 34-year-old Howard was able to thrive as a solid spark off the bench. His rebounding, his rim protection, and his lob finishing were all tremendously impactful bonuses for his team. As you all know, the Lakers went on to win the 2020 NBA championship, as Dwight secured his first and only championship ring of his roller coaster career. So in conclusion, just how good was Dwight Howard really? To me, he was one of the best players of his era. ESPN had the audacity to rank him as the second best player in 2011, and even then, I thought that was a little generous. But for me, he was definitely a top 5 player at his peak, who had the potential to be one of the greatest centers in basketball history. But due to his lack of solid post moves, his lack of aggression, and his inability to create his own shot, that was a potential that he simply never reached.
Allen Iverson, also known as The Answer. A 6-foot point guard / shooting guard who dominated the NBA in the early 2000s with his skill, talent, and heart. Iverson was an 11-time All-Star, a 4-time scoring champion, a league MVP. He made 7 All-NBA teams, and he led the league in steals 3 times. He was a first-ballot Hall of Famer and is one of the all-time scoring leaders of NBA history. With all of that being said, Iverson was a quite polarizing character, and not just during his career, not just with his off-the-field antics or with his media controversies. It's actually his legacy that's quite polarizing to NBA fans as we reflect on his NBA career. You see, Iverson's career and numbers have many NBA fans very divided about just how good he actually was. Some fans will swear by the fact that Iverson was the most dominant little guard they've ever seen, while a large number of other NBA fans will claim he was simply an overrated and inefficient stat-stuffing chucker. The point of this video will be to see where Iverson actually lies. We're going to take a look at his numbers and some of the narratives about him and put those into context, and by the end of this video, we'll see where Iverson ranks among the greatest guards of the NBA's rich history. Allen Iverson played 14 seasons in the NBA up until he was 34 years old, and in those 14 seasons, he averaged 26.7 points, 6.2 assists, 3.7 rebounds, 2.2 steals on 42.5% shooting. He managed these numbers with his terrific and all-time great ball handling, his solid footwork, his mean crossover dribble, his smooth jumper, and because of his willingness to attack the basket continuously, even on nights when plenty of contact and physical punishment was being dealt to him. Iverson wasn't the greatest on-ball defender, which he himself has admitted, but he was fantastic in the passing lanes and managed to pull in plenty of steals throughout his career. He was also a greater passer and distributor than he often gets credit for. Yes, it's no secret that Iverson's preference was clearly to shoot the basketball, but he had great court vision and managed to make solid passes and get tons of assists considering the amount of shots per game he was taking. On Iverson's career, he shot 21.8 shots per game and averaged 6.2 assists per game. His 21.8 shots is the 4th highest shots per game average in NBA history. Of the top 10 players with the highest shots per game average of all time, only one player averaged more assists per game over his career than Allen Iverson, which was Jerry West. Among these players are legends like Michael Jordan, Pistol Pete Maravich, and Rick Barry, and Iverson averaged more assists per game than all of them. But clearly, the biggest and most talked about aspect of Iverson's career was his scoring. So let's dig into that. He has the 7th highest career scoring average in NBA history at 26.7 points per game. Among guards specifically, that's the 3rd highest career scoring average of all time. He accomplished the 7th highest points per game average in NBA history as a 6-foot guard. A player of Iverson's size or smaller who has the closest career points per game average is the 5'9" Isaiah Thomas, who averaged about 18 points per game and is ranked 100 on the all-time list. That means Iverson is 93 spots ahead of the closest player on the list of his size or smaller.
This is why many call Iverson the greatest pound-for-pound player in NBA history, because even as a very small man by NBA standards, he dominated NBA superstars much bigger and stronger than him. Sure, small guys like Isaiah Thomas average over 25 points per game for a single season, but Iverson did it for over a decade's worth of basketball. The answer was one of only 8 players in NBA history to average at least 25 points per game in 10 consecutive seasons. That's a feat scoring legends like Kobe Bryant, Wilt Chamberlain, and Larry Bird never even accomplished. The other 7 players who accomplished the feat were Michael Jordan, Jerry West, Shaquille O'Neal, Karl Malone, Dominique Wilkins, Kevin Durant, and LeBron James. Needless to say, that's some legendary company, and Iverson is by far the smallest player in that group of scoring legends. Now I know what many of you are thinking, and this is the greatest criticism of Iverson's career. Everyone acknowledges that he scored a ton of points, but many will discredit him as a scorer and scream of his perceived inefficiency. Iverson indeed shot 42.5% from the field in his career. As far as scoring guards go, his 42.5% is much lower than Jordan's 49.7% and a bit lower than Kobe's 44.7%. In fact, out of the top 20 players in NBA history with the highest points per game average, Iverson has the lowest field goal percentage of that group. Obviously, with these facts, you can't possibly try to argue that Iverson was one of the more efficient scorers of NBA history. But with that being said, context is needed to understand why the inefficiency narrative is blown far out of proportion in the case of Allen Iverson. First of all, Allen Iverson was a small guard, meaning he was a perimeter player. Guards naturally play more from the outside and take more shots from a greater distance, so naturally and typically a guard's field goal percentage is lower than a forward's and much lower than a center's. To compare the field goal percentage of Iverson to Shaquille O'Neal or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar would be stupid. Don't do that. They clearly play much different positions on the court, which naturally affect their percentages. It makes much more sense and is much more fair to compare Iverson's efficiency to other scoring guards. Sure, Iverson still has a lower field goal percentage than Jordan, Kobe, Wade, Steph, Harden, and Westbrook, but at least they're a lot more comparable now. Also, field goal percentage is only one way of looking at a player's efficiency. True shooting percentage can give you a more complete picture. While field goal percentage only factors a player's efficiency in shots from the field, true shooting percentage factors in their field goals, their free throws, and their three-point shooting. This might surprise you, but Iverson has a greater true shooting percentage than scoring legends like Isaiah Thomas, Elgin Baylor, Pistol Pete Maravich, and John Havlicek. These are typically players who aren't heavily criticized for their inefficiency, but for some reason Iverson is, even though he was technically more efficient than them. Sure, small guards like Steph Curry and John Stockton dwarf Iverson when it comes to efficiency, but his efficiency numbers are comparable to guys like Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Isaiah Thomas, and Russell Westbrook. Also, efficiency and a player's field goal percentage has a lot to do with who he was playing with. For example, it's no coincidence that Kevin Durant's 3 most efficient field goal percentage seasons of his career happened to be the 3 seasons he played with the Warriors with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. When you have other great offensive players on your team, they naturally garner more attention, which opens up the floor more and gives you more opportunities for cleaner looks. This is a luxury that Iverson didn't have in his playing days with the 76ers. Let me ask you a question. Who was the best offensive player that Iverson played with during his 76ers days? Larry Hughes? Eric Snow? A young and developing Andre Iguodala? Everyone who was watching basketball in the early 2000s knows full well that Allen Iverson carried the 76ers offensively during those years, and that defense's main goal every night against the 76ers was to put a stop to Allen Iverson. He was also leaned upon so heavily offensively that Iverson led the league in minutes per game 6 out of the 10 years he played for the 76ers. Naturally, that lack of help scoring the ball, the huge amount of minutes, and the overall giant load offensively is going to affect your efficiency. It wasn't until Iverson's 76ers days were over when he joined the Denver Nuggets that we finally got to see him play with star power help offensively. Carmelo Anthony was there to share some of that scoring load with Iverson, and the result? Iverson shot a much better 45.6% from the field those 3 years he played with the Nuggets. That's a field goal percentage that then exceeds Kobe Bryant's efficiency. Hopefully this helps illustrates the importance of the supporting cast in a player's overall efficiency. Although I'm certainly not putting Iverson on the Mount Rushmore of NBA efficiency, but given the context, I'm also not going to discredit him or claim that he was overrated based on his percentages. Any star player who played in those days will tell you how lethal AI was and how hard he was to stop. A different aspect some people don't realize is that AI was a player who consistently brought his A game when it mattered most. He was a big game player and a clutch performer. It comes as no surprise that Michael Jordan has the highest points per game average in NBA playoff history. But second isn't Kobe Bryant, it isn't LeBron James, Kevin Durant, or Wilt Chamberlain. The second greatest scorer in NBA playoff history was none other than Allen Iverson, who scored an incredible 29.7 points per game in his career for the playoffs. Among that playoff average were games where he scored 50 plus points, his back-to-back 40-point games to close out the talented Milwaukee Bucks in the Eastern Conference Finals, and of course his legendary 48-point game in the finals to defeat the previously undefeated Shaq and Kobe Los Angeles Lakers. This is why this moment is so iconic, because it perfectly sums up the legendary Allen Iverson. Even in an NBA Finals with the juggernaut Lakers looking for a perfect postseason run, even they couldn't stop a prime Iverson from stomping over them.
Tracy Lamar McGrady is seen by some as one of the most underrated players of NBA history. He was a 6'8" shooting guard and small forward who had terrific ball handling skills, fantastic range with the ability to hit highly contested shots, and he was a fierce slasher and finisher at the rim. Unfortunately for T-Mac, his career was cut short due to numerous injuries, but most notably of those injuries was his laboring back problems. If it wasn't for the back issues that plagued him, T-Mac would have been much higher on the NBA's all-time lists. He's a Hall of Famer who made 7 All-Star teams and 7 All-NBA teams. He didn't have the longevity that many other greats have enjoyed, but when he was in his prime, some would argue that he was as good as just about anyone. So how good was Tracy McGrady really? Well, let's take it back to the beginning of his career. Tracy was drafted straight out of high school in 1997 by the Toronto Raptors with the 9th overall pick. He took a bit of time to develop into the superstar player we remember. As an 18-year-old in his rookie season, he averaged just 7 points in only 18 minutes per game. The following year, he saw a slight uptick in his minutes, but he was still averaging just 9 points and nearly 6 rebounds. It wasn't until his third year in the league that McGrady became a solid rotation player. During the 1999-2000 season, McGrady was often in the role of the sixth man for the Raptors. In that role, he averaged 15.4 points, 6.3 rebounds, and 1.9 blocks on 31 minutes per game. At this point, the talent and potential of their star tandem could be clearly seen. Vince Carter was already a premier scorer and superstar, right as McGrady was starting to come into his own, similar to how Scottie Pippen developed alongside of an already elite Michael Jordan. Unfortunately though, Tracy had something else in mind. During the 2000 offseason, McGrady experienced his first free agency and ended up signing with the Orlando Magic. By doing this, Tracy was returning to his home state of Florida, where he would no longer be under the shadow of Vince Carter and could begin to lead his own franchise. It's a move that McGrady has since said that he regrets, but we'll touch on that more later. Assisting McGrady in Orlando was supposed to be the newly signed superstar Grant Hill, but Hill only played 4 games in their first season together as his ongoing ankle injury started to ruin his career as a star from this point on. This meant that T-Mac was now, for the first time, given the wheel of a franchise and was in a position where he would need to carry the team offensively. And in this position, McGrady thrived. That year, he averaged 26.8 points, 7.5 rebounds, 4.6 assists, 1.5 steals, and 1.5 blocks on 46% shooting. He was only 21 years old, and he was a monster on both sides of the ball and won the Most Improved Player award as he drug his shorthanded Magic into the playoffs. Over the next 3 years with the Magic, he continued his dominance, leading the league in scoring 2 out of those 3 seasons, averaging 32 points per game and 28 points per game. During this window of McGrady's dominance with the Magic, the ongoing debate was between Kobe and McGrady as to who was the best wing player in the NBA. In McGrady's first 3 years with Orlando, he led them to the playoffs each of those seasons, but in his 4th year, much of the supporting talent was gone. The team was dealing with a slew of injuries, Doc Rivers had been fired 11 games into the season, and drama was going on behind the scenes between McGrady and the team's general manager.
This all led up to McGrady being traded that offseason to the Houston Rockets. A 25-year-old McGrady was now paired up with Houston's new superstar big man Yao Ming in what looked like it was shaping up to be a Western Conference contender for years to come. The duo won 51 games, with McGrady averaging around 25 points, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists. This was McGrady's only completely healthy season with the Houston Rockets. His signature moment with the team was when he rallied his Rockets to beat the San Antonio Spurs after trailing by 8 points with less than 40 seconds remaining in the game. He scored 13 points in the final 35 seconds in what was likely the greatest comeback in NBA history. This was the last iconic image of McGrady as a healthy and ascending superstar because in the season after that, his career-burdening back problems began. He would have some solid production in the few years after that, but he would never again see the elite days of Orlando or of his first season in Houston. If you look at some of the greatest wing players of NBA history, like Jordan, Kobe, Wade, and LeBron, and give them a career-altering back injury by the time they're 26 years old, well then that completely changes their legacies. Numerous MVPs, championships, and scoring titles erased from history as a result. This was the kind of talent and trajectory T-Mac was on before the injury bug took over. Essentially, we only had a 5-year window to witness a healthy and featured Tracy McGrady. During T-Mac's best years, he kept losing in the first round of the playoffs, but it's not like it was because he was usually underperforming. In fact, his numbers actually often rose in the playoffs despite the stiffer competition. He simply didn't have the circumstances or best opportunities to win like he could have had. McGrady's career was basically a giant collection of near misses and what-ifs. What if McGrady and Carter never split up from Toronto? They would have been a force. Kobe Bryant once said in an interview concerning this duo that with McGrady and Carter and their numerous vets on the team, had they have stuck together, they could have won championships. If Grant Hill isn't suffering from career-ruining foot injuries, maybe McGrady and Hill are contending for titles with the Orlando Magic. If back injuries aren't laboring McGrady, maybe the Rockets are winning championships, especially in the 2008 to 2009 season. That Rockets team, led by Ron Artest and Yao Ming, pushed that season's champion, the Los Angeles Lakers, to a 7th game in the West semifinals. They were the closest of any team that year to defeating the champion Lakers, despite the fact that they had lost McGrady for the year early in the season. If a healthy T-Mac is available with Artest and Yao Ming, that's likely enough to win the title that year. Regardless, a short and burdened career is what we got from McGrady, but we still remember his talent and his peak. When he was at his best, he was one of the greatest scorers of all time. He was an elite rival to Kobe Bryant as one of the best players in the league, and he was one of the most all-around dominant wing players of NBA history.
When we talk about the greatest big men of NBA history, specifically the topic of power forwards, there are several names that usually get brought up, like Tim Duncan, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, Dirk Nowitzki, and Kevin Garnett to name a few. But one of the names that belongs in that discussion but very rarely gets mentioned is the Celtics legend Kevin McHale. Although you won't hear the media or casual NBA fans bring him up, this guy is respected and held in high regard by his contemporaries of the 80s. They certainly recognize his place in the discussion. There's reasons why he's overlooked, which we'll get into, but we'll start by recognizing his talent and accomplishments throughout his early career. So sit back and enjoy as I once again do my favorite thing to do as a Lakers fan, which is make a positive video about a Celtics player. Kevin McHale was drafted in the 1980 draft with the 3rd overall pick by the Boston Celtics. He was a 6'10" power forward who was extremely skilled and had sound fundamentals. Although his talent could be recognized upon his arrival to the league, he wasn't necessarily tearing up the competition immediately, and instead developed his game slowly over time. As a rookie, playing 20 minutes a game, Kevin averaged 10 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 1.8 blocks per game on 53% shooting. He had the talent and the production to be a starter, but the Celtics were actually pretty stacked at the time, especially in terms of their big men. Within 2 years, Boston had acquired Robert Parrish, Larry Bird, and Kevin McHale, which would be their Hall of Fame front line of the future. They also had Cedric Maxwell, who was a 6'8" small forward and a great player in his own right. With Parrish starting at center and Bird and Maxwell starting at the forward positions, there simply wasn't room for McHale to start. So in the early years of his career, he thrived in his role as the team's 6th man. Serving as a complementary piece behind Bird, Parrish, and Maxwell, McHale and the Celtics finished with a 62-20 record and went on to defeat the Houston Rockets in the NBA Finals to win the championship. Over the next 4 seasons, he would continue to come off the bench and make an impact, averaging 16.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 1.9 blocks on 55% shooting over those 4 years. In 2 of those seasons, he was the 6th man of the year, and in 1984, he added his 2nd championship ring in a 7-game series victory over the Lakers. At this point, McHale had already built a nice resume for himself, but his career was about to take off to another level. In September of 1985, the Celtics traded an aging Cedric Maxwell to the Clippers for Bill Walton, who would serve as the team's backup center and as their new 6th man. The departure of Maxwell meant that the starting forward position had now become available to McHale, and Kevin was quick to make Boston forget about their previous starting forward. In his first season as a starter, Kevin averaged 21.3 points, 8.1 rebounds, and 2 blocks on 57.4% shooting. With their big 3 leading the way, and with their deep roster, the 1986 Boston Celtics dominated their way through the regular season as they finished with a 67-15 record, and they were the league's best defensive team, which McHale was a major part of. This year was one of his 6 all-defense team appearances. There was nothing flashy about his defense. He wasn't the most athletic and wouldn't sky through the air to block a shot, but he was tenacious. He did an excellent job of moving his feet and staying in front of the defender while keeping his hands high. Under the leadership of Bird and McHale, the '86 Celtics won yet another championship, defeating the Rockets in 6 games. Although Larry Bird was named the Finals MVP of the series, there was definitely an argument that it could have gone to McHale, who averaged 25.8 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks on 57% shooting over the series. It's worth noting that these impressive numbers came against the likes of great big men defenders in Hakeem Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson. To this day, the '86 Celtics are seen as one of the greatest basketball teams of all time. Even with all of this being said, we were still yet to see the best of McHale. The following season would be his best yet, and a year where he made history. As a 29-year-old in his prime year, he averaged 26.1 points, 9.9 rebounds, and 2.2 blocks on an incredible 60.4% shooting. His 60.4% shooting came on 17 shots per game. Players almost never scored that many points with such high efficiency. He also shot 83.6% from the free throw line, making him the first player to ever shoot 60% from the field and over 80% from the free throw line in the same season. It was during this stretch of his career that the term torture chamber came up a lot. This was in reference to the players who had to guard McHale in the low post. At the time, he had arguably the best footwork and low post moves in the game, right there with Hakeem Olajuwon. It was also extremely difficult for defenders to contest his shot, since he was a 6'10 player with a high release point way above his head. With how unstoppable he was as an offensive player, it made sense why they said his defenders in the low post were in his torture chamber. Towards the end of the 1987 season, the best year of his career, with just a few games left before the playoffs, McHale broke his navicular bone in his right foot. This ultimately would be a career-altering injury for the big man. Doctors advised him to get surgery and sit out the rest of the season, which is what just about any other player would have done, but not Kevin McHale. He was one of the toughest players to ever play the game and desperately wanted his Celtics to repeat as NBA champions. So he played out the rest of the regular season and throughout the playoffs on his broken foot. Was this incredibly tough? Yes. Was this absolutely legendary? Yes. Was this also extremely reckless and bad for his career in the long term? Yeah, it was probably that too. Regardless, he played at an incredibly high level in the playoffs. Despite the enormous pain, he averaged 21.1 points, 9.2 rebounds, and 1.4 blocks on 58% shooting throughout the 1987 postseason. Despite his courageous effort, the Celtics came up short, losing in the NBA Finals to the Lakers in 6 games. He would get surgery on his foot in the off-season, and he would have some really great and productive seasons afterwards, but his Celtics were done winning championships, and he would never again return to his prime form that he had experienced before the severe injuries entered his career. When you look at his averages and his rankings on the all-time list, it might seem a bit underwhelming, but you have to consider the fact that McHale spent most of his career as either a sixth man with limited minutes or as a star dealing with injuries. The reality is, he only had 2 healthy seasons as a starter before he broke his foot in March of 1987. He didn't have the longevity that many other greats have enjoyed, but the truth is, when he was good, he was really, really good on both sides of the basketball. Let me know in the comments section where you rank a prime Kevin McHale among the greatest power forwards of all time. Only 14 players in NBA history have won multiple MVPs throughout their career, and this guy is one of them. Steve John Nash, famously known as the leader of the high-scoring Phoenix Suns in the 2000s. But his MVPs are still some of the most controversial and hotly debated awards of league history, which then begs the question, just how good was Steve Nash really? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, and we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. The 6'3" point guard was drafted with the 15th overall pick in the 1996 NBA draft by the Phoenix Suns. There wasn't a tremendous amount of hype surrounding him upon entering the league, as some described him as a poor man's John Stockton. Another reason for his lack of hype was because he was somewhat overshadowed by the overall talent in the 1996 NBA draft, which has a legitimate argument for the claim of the greatest draft class of league history. Nash was going to have to prove himself in order to earn his minutes, a task that would be difficult considering how he spent his first 2 seasons in Phoenix behind great established point guards like Kevin Johnson, Sam Cassell, and Jason Kidd. In his first 2 seasons, he only managed to put up very modest numbers in his few minutes. It wasn't until the summer after the completion of his second season that the Dallas organization recognized his potential and traded for the 24-year-old guard. Nash immediately became a starter for the Mavericks, but his game was still developing slowly to go along with the fact that he was dealing with injuries over the next 2 seasons. It wasn't until his 3rd season with Dallas that Nash began to break out as a premier point guard, as he put up around 15 points and 7 assists on 48.7% shooting. He was decently close to his first 50-40-90 season, something that would go on to become a theme of his career. With his solid form and with his high-arcing jumper, he established himself as one of the most reliable and efficient shooters of the game. Over the next several seasons, his game would slightly improve in Dallas, and with the help of Dirk Nowitzki and Michael Finley, the Big Three Mavericks were consistently making noise in the Western Conference playoffs, making it as far as the West Finals in 2003, where they were eventually eliminated by Tim Duncan's Spurs. Heading into the summer of 2004, Nash had put up solid numbers in his recent years with Dallas, but he wasn't quite in the conversation yet of the best point guards of the entire league. Nash was also 30 years old and entering free agency. Typically, an NBA player's best years are behind him by the time he's reached his 30s, and Mavericks owner Mark Cuban had already committed to pay a significant salary to players like Anton Jamison, Michael Finley, Antoine Walker, and Dirk Nowitzki. Cuban offered Nash a 4-year deal that would pay him $9 million per year, but Phoenix offered him a 6-year deal for $63 million, which Cuban was not willing to match. So it was back to the Phoenix Suns for Nash, who were just coming off of a 29-53 season. This is where the star point guard's career would completely take off, as it was the perfect setting for his skill set and style. The new head coach of the Phoenix Suns was Mike D'Antoni, who loved to play a high-scoring and up-tempo style, which highly emphasizes perimeter shooting. Under D'Antoni, Nash and the Suns became famous for their 7-second offense, where the goal was to take each shot attempt within the first 7 seconds of gaining possession. Transition basketball is where Nash excels, as his ability to make quick decisions significantly improved his assists per game within this offense. With supporting talent like Joe Johnson, Sean Marion, and Amari Stoudemire, Nash led Phoenix to a league-best 62-20 record, which was a 33-win improvement over the previous season. On the year, Nash put up 15.5 points and a league-leading 11.5 assists on remarkable all-around efficiency. With Nash being Phoenix's only major acquisition, he improved the team from the bottom half of the league offensively to the best in the entire league. This impactful performance earned him the 2005 League MVP award. He continued his terrific play all the way into the Western Conference Finals, where they were eventually eliminated by the defensively superior San Antonio Spurs. The following season, Suns star Amari Stoudemire was lost for the season due to a knee injury, and shooting guard Joe Johnson had been traded away in the offseason. So the short-handed Suns were not expected to be anywhere close to contenders, but that's when Nash showed his ability to make his teammates better, and actually improved upon his MVP numbers from the previous season, as he led his Phoenix Suns to an improbable 54-28 record.
He also did it while achieving a 50-40-90 season, which only 8 other players have done in NBA history. More on that later. Thanks to his incredible play, and thanks to the way he led his team to exceed expectations in a tough Western Conference, Nash was named the league's MVP for the second straight season. Somehow, Nash once again pushed his Suns all the way to the Western Conference Finals, where they eventually lost in 6 games to the Dallas Mavericks. But this wouldn't be the last time that Nash would lead his team to be serious contenders. After another impressive regular season and a near third straight MVP award, Nash led his Suns into the postseason with a 61-21 record, and waiting for them in the West semifinals was their rival, the San Antonio Spurs. This series is still considered as one of the great what-ifs of NBA history. Nash was having a great series, and the Suns won the 4th game, which tied the series at 2 games apiece. But unfortunately, it came at a major cost. Late in the 4th game, in a one-possession situation, Robert Horry gives Nash a very hard hip check, which results in an altercation between Raja Bell and Horry, and several players leave the bench. But the altercation between Bell and Horry is not the part that potentially changed the course of the series. Due to the league office being a bit paranoid shortly after the Malice at the Palace, the league had extremely harsh punishments for any players who left the bench during an altercation. Among those players in this specific situation were key members of the Suns roster in Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw. For this simple move towards center court, both players were suspended from the crucial 5th game in Phoenix, a game that San Antonio would win, and they would eventually win the series and the championship as well. If these silly suspensions never took place, then Steve Nash may have a championship ring on his resume, but unfortunately, that championship would never come. When we look at the totality of Nash's career, we see that he was an 8-time All-Star, a 7-time All-NBA player, a 5-time assist champion, a 2-time league MVP, and he's currently in 3rd place on the NBA's all-time assist list. He's also among the most efficient players the game has ever seen. He has the 2nd greatest free throw percentage in league history behind only Steph Curry at 90.4%. He also had 4 seasons with 50-40-90 percentages, which is twice as much as the nearest competitor of league history, which is Larry Bird. But wait, it gets even more impressive. Not only does Nash hold the record with 4 50-40-90 seasons, but from the 02-03 season through the 2012-2013 season, Nash averaged 50-40-90 percentages. That means, for an entire decade, Nash did what only a handful of players have done for just a single season. It's not like he was a completely perfect player though. Among Nash's weaknesses was his defense, as he was a little too slow with his lateral movement to keep up with the quicker point guards in the league, especially during his days with Phoenix and beyond. With that being said, he's one of those players who would have loved to have played in the modern NBA with all the transition basketball and 3-point shooting. Since his retirement, Nash has since stated that he wished he had shot more 3-pointers during his playing days, and he certainly could have. One of his listed weaknesses on the day he was drafted was the fact that he's a bit too selective with his shots, and that trend continued throughout his NBA career, which played a large part in why he had such incredible efficiency percentages. All in all, Nash is one of the great point guards of league history, and in my opinion, from a team impact standpoint, he certainly earned his 2 MVP awards.
Every once in a while, a player sticks around for so long that people lose track of how lethal he was in his prime. There are many examples of players who fit that description, like Vince Carter and Dwight Howard, but my favorite example of that is none other than Dirk Nowitzki. Dirk was a 7-foot power forward / center who played 21 years of his career faithfully for the Mavericks. He was also a 14-time All-Star and made 12 All-NBA teams. He's currently 6th on the all-time scoring list with 31,560 points. Everybody knows that Dirk is an all-timer and a future Hall of Famer, but the area I want to focus on in this video is the prime of his career, because Dirk was truly something else during that time, and people are either too quick to forget or too young to fully understand his impact during that time. So let's evaluate his greatness by taking it back to the beginning of his career up through his prime days. Dirk was drafted in 1998 with the 9th overall pick by the Milwaukee Bucks, before they ended up trading him to the Dallas Mavericks for the big man, Robert Tractor Traylor, in what was possibly the most regrettable decision in Bucks history. But it didn't look that way initially, since Dirk's career got off to a very slow start. The 98-99 season was a lockout-shortened year that only had 50 regular season games. Dirk was only 20 years old and was having a difficult time adjusting to the style of American basketball. A skinny, lengthy perimeter big man wasn't something that was common in the late 90s, and the physicality was taking its toll on him. Fans were even sarcastically calling him Irk Nowitzki due to the lack of D in his game. In only 20 minutes a game, Dirk averaged 8.2 points and 3.4 rebounds on just 40% shooting. It was also a very forgettable season for the Mavericks as a whole, as the team missed the playoffs and finished with a 19-31 record. It was so difficult on Dirk that he even said he considered leaving the NBA and heading back to Germany to play out his basketball career over there. Fortunately for us all, he didn't end up doing that. Several changes were made for his sophomore season. For one, Mark Cuban purchased the team. Dirk credited Cuban for changing the team's atmosphere into a winning culture. Under Don Nelson's coaching, and with another year of development, Nowitzki significantly improved his play and all of his numbers, averaging 17.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists on 46% shooting, which was good enough to finish as the runner-up for the Most Improved Player award. They didn't make the playoffs this season either, but the following year is when their winning days would begin. From the 2001 to 2010-2011 season, the Mavericks had over 50 wins each year with Dirk leading the way. Over this 10-year stretch, he averaged 24.3 points, 8.8 rebounds, and 2.8 assists on 48% shooting, 38.5% from 3, and 88% from the free throw line. This is a point I want to take a moment to emphasize, is this man's uniqueness and efficiency. During this era of basketball, the game was dominated by bruising back-to-the-basket big men like Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Chris Webber, and Amari Stoudemire. And then there was Dirk Nowitzki, who dominated with finesse, fadeaways, and efficient shooting from distance. During Dirk's prime, the league was shooting less than half the amount of three-pointers they're shooting today, and yet still he stood out in that era with that style. The truth is, the man was so ahead of his time that he shouldn't have been as good as he was, given the era he played in. A player like Dirk Nowitzki is made for today's game, and there's no question in my mind that he would have an absolute feast in this current era. Speaking of efficiency, his most efficient season of his career was the 2006-2007 season, where he averaged 24.6 points, 8.9 rebounds, and 3.4 assists on 50.2% from the field, 41.6% from 3, and 90.4% from the free throw line. That's a historic 50-40-90 season. In the history of the NBA, only 8 players have ever made the 50-40-90 club. Dirk is the only 7-footer to ever do it. When you factor in his size, his sharpshooting abilities, and his signature fadeaway, you can begin to see how a prime Dirk Nowitzki was one of the most indefensible players of all time. There were so many occasions where he was going to score, and there was absolutely nothing the defender could do about it. It was that 50-40-90 season where his Mavericks won a franchise record 67 games, and he was named the league's MVP. Now this is where some of Dirk's prime years get a little bit tricky. As we mentioned, the Mavericks won a lot of games during that era, and were often going to the Western Conference playoffs as a high-seeded team. Yet despite that, the Mavericks often came up short in the playoffs. An often forgotten aspect of Dirk's legacy is that before the 2011 NBA Finals, the NBA community by and large viewed Dirk as a player who was an underperformer in the postseason. Some would even go as far as saying he was a choker. I don't think I would go that far, but there is some merit to it. In the 2006 NBA Finals, the Mavericks had a 2-0 lead in the series over the Miami Heat and then lost the next 4 straight. Some people believe that had more to do with the refs than Dirk and the Mavericks, but I digress. In the following year, Dirk's MVP season, where they won 67 games, they were upset in the first round by a seemingly less talented Golden State Warriors team. This was an MVP-led Dallas Mavericks team that had just won a franchise record 67 games and was the top seed in the conference, losing in the first round to an 8th-seeded team in 6 games. And then, in the next 3 years after that, his Mavericks lost in the first or second round, despite being a 50-plus win team each year. These were significantly huge blows to the legacy of Dirk Nowitzki, but we all know how he redeemed himself. The famous 2011 NBA Finals, where Dirk's Mavericks upset the super team Miami Heat of LeBron, Wade, and Bosh. I don't think there was ever a time in NBA history where one series mattered more to one player's legacy than the 2011 finals mattered to Dirk's legacy. He showed up big, dropped his 26 points per game and 9.7 rebounds per game while securing the finals MVP. But if he hadn't pulled that off, well then people would still remember him as a great player who couldn't get it done in the postseason. Fortunately, he did win in the finals and his legacy was saved. With all of this being said, I personally think it's pretty remarkable that he even won a championship. Just about the entirety of his career, he was lacking superstar help. He had Steve Nash early in his career, but at that point, Nash was not the player he would be in Phoenix. Who else did he have? Michael Finley? Jason Terry? Tyson Chandler? Josh Howard? An old Jason Kidd? He was basically never a part of a trio or even a duo that you would expect to win championships. If you think about many of the great players who played in that era, many of them were much more fortunate with the co-stars they got to play with. Kobe had said that for the longest time he had tried to recruit Dirk to play with him on the Lakers. Imagine if that had happened. How much winning do you think Dirk would have done then? But Dirk had always turned him down, because he never wanted to leave his Mavericks. And honestly, that's what makes Dirk so special. He could have won more elsewhere, he could have been a part of a super team, but instead he was loyal and played 21 years for the same franchise, which is the most seasons in NBA history for a player to play with only one team. He wasn't the quickest, he wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the greatest defensive player. But the truth is, Dirk was a loyal legend who wasn't expected to win a championship, and given his circumstances, he probably shouldn't have, but he did. And that's much more than many legends can say. He wasn't the greatest ever at his position, he wasn't an all-time great two-way player, but he was an all-time great from an efficiency standpoint, and he was one of the hardest players to guard the NBA has ever seen. He was also one of a kind, and he did it his way. I said it once and I'll say it again. The way he played his game, there is absolutely zero question in my mind that he would torch today's league.
He's one of the greatest players of basketball history, and is arguably the most dominant player to ever live. So making a video that asks the question, how good was Shaquille O'Neal really, may seem ridiculous when the answer seems so obvious. Really, really good. But as someone who followed the entirety of Shaq's career very closely, I can definitely say that there's some underappreciated aspects and some misconceptions about his game and legacy. Today, we're analyzing the career of Shaquille O'Neal as we attempt to gain a more thorough and educated perspective of his resume. It was no secret that Shaq was a highly coveted prospect heading into the NBA, as he was taken out of LSU with the first overall pick in the 1992 draft by the Orlando Magic. This was a very different version of the Diesel than the one that we would come to know in Los Angeles, as this younger version of Shaq was slimmer, quicker, more agile, and simply more athletic overall. In many ways, this version of Shaq strongly resembled a prime Giannis, as he had lean muscle and was capable of handling the ball and could even take it coast to coast if he wanted to. This wasn't incredibly common, as he was still a true center at his core, who relentlessly dominated the game in the paint. In his rookie season, he was 7 foot 1 inches tall and was hovering around 300 pounds and played in 81 of the 82 games, as he poured in averages of 23.4 points, 13.9 rebounds, and 3.5 blocks on 56.2% shooting. Due to his dominance, the Magic improved their record over the previous season by 20 wins, and he was immediately being recognized as one of the best centers in the entire league. Simply put, it was one of the all-time great debut seasons of NBA history, as the 20-year-old was one of the most NBA-ready rookies that the league has ever seen. The following season, they drafted the incredibly gifted and dynamic point guard Penny Hardaway, and this is when Shaq's Magic went from simply a young team with potential to a young contender in the Eastern Conference. At this point, Shaq was only 21 years old, as he led the Magic to a 50-32 record as a sophomore, as he put up 29.3 points, 13.2 rebounds, and 2.9 blocks on 59.9% shooting. He led the league in overall field goal percentage, he was second in scoring, second in rebounding, and fourth in blocks. Again, he achieved all of this in his second season, while going up against the strongest era of the big man that the league has ever seen. In total, Shaq spent 4 years in Orlando and was close to winning the championship on multiple occasions. The first instance was in the 1995 NBA Finals, where his Magic was famously swept by the more experienced Houston Rockets. But what many people don't realize is that despite being beat by Hakeem, Shaq had a dominant series and was certainly blameless in their defeat. The other instance was in 1996, where his 60-win Magic were eliminated in the Eastern Conference Finals by the 72-10 Chicago Bulls. Then in the summer of 1996, Shaq stunned the city of Orlando by leaving for Los Angeles, where the real meat of his legacy would begin. During this era is when Shaq started to reach his peak dominating form. He did put on a significant amount of weight, but in the early years with the Lakers, much of that was sheer muscle mass. Yes, this did decrease some of the speed and agility of the Diesel, but that doesn't mean that Shaq's only skill set in Los Angeles was simply overpowering people. That is a common narrative about his prime, that Shaq simply scored in bunches by bullying the opponent. And although he did certainly manhandle the opposition, it's not quite his entire skill set. One thing that's rarely mentioned is that Shaq had extremely underrated footwork. Sure, he wasn't Akeem Olajuwon or Kevin McHale, but Shaq often took advantage of every step and intelligently utilized his pivot foot to get himself into the best positions for scoring. He also had an extremely reliable jump hook shot for the instances where he wasn't close enough to simply dunk the basketball over the defender. Another specific quality that is rarely spoken of was Shaq's willingness to punish the opponent physically regardless of his God-given size. Kobe Bryant spoke about this rare mentality in an interview several years ago.
For sure. I mean, this guy was a force like I have never seen. I mean, it was crazy. You know, a guy at that size, generally guys at that size are a little timid and they don't want to be tall. They don't want to be big. Man, this dude he did not care. He was mean. He was nasty. He was competitive. He was vindictive.
For 3 straight years under Del Harris, Shaq and the Lakers looked like a promising team, ready to compete for the NBA championship. But it wasn't until his first year with Phil Jackson that he would finally break through and reach the mountaintop. It also happened to be the greatest season of Shaq's career on an individual level, as he won his lone MVP in the 1999-2000 season, with averages of 29.7 points, 13.6 rebounds, 3.8 assists, and 3 blocks on 57.4% shooting. That season, he was first in scoring, second in rebounds, first in assists among centers, third in blocks, and first in field goal percentage. One thing that people often overlook is the fact that Shaq finished second overall in the Defensive Player of the Year voting behind only Alonzo Mourning. With this effort, he led his Lakers to a dominant 67-15 record and was rewarded with the MVP as a result. But in my opinion, he should have been the first unanimous MVP of NBA history. But he only received 120 of the 121 total votes, as the CNN reporter Fred Hickman voted for Allen Iverson instead, who clearly had an inferior season. Shaq would not only go on to win his first championship and his first Finals MVP, but he had arguably the greatest Finals MVP stretch of NBA history, challenged only by Michael Jordan's run from 1991 to 1993. There's an ongoing debate about whether or not Shaq carried Kobe during their 3 championship runs, and I certainly think it's disrespectful to Kobe to imply that a star of his caliber was carried. But I will say this. During that run, Shaq was the clear focal point of the Lakers' offense. The game plan was always to go through him, while the opponent's game plan was always about containing him. In other words, Shaq was the Batman to Kobe's Robin, both in terms of statistics and impact. Yes, Batman needed Robin to succeed, but let's not get it twisted. We know who was where in terms of the Lakers' hierarchy. Of the 3 Finals MVPs, Shaq's most impressive was probably his second, as you consider how he did it against that season's Defensive Player of the Year, Dikembe Mutombo. If he, of all people, couldn't contain Shaq in the finals, then absolutely no one could have that season. After that final stretch, it was around the 2003 to 2004 season that Shaq's physical fitness began to decline as he put on a significant amount of weight, rumored to be around 350 pounds, which played a part in Kobe's frustration with Shaq that ultimately led to their split. At this point in his career, it was clear that Shaq was still the most dominant center in the league, but it was also apparent that his prime years were now behind him. After a disappointing finals exit in 2004, Lakers management decided that they were ready to build upon their younger star and traded Shaq to the Miami Heat. Although the Diesel had clearly lost a step, he still stood out enough to be a serious MVP candidate. Alongside of a rookie Dwayne Wade, Shaq and the Heat went on to win 59 games throughout the regular season, which was the best record in the Eastern Conference. Throughout the season, Shaq put up solid averages of 22.9 points, 10.4 rebounds, 2.7 assists, and 2.3 blocks on 60.1% shooting. He was so impactful that he barely placed second in the MVP race to Steve Nash, separated by only a total of 34 points. It's one of the more controversial MVPs of league history, seeing how Shaq bested Nash in nearly every major advanced stat, like win shares, player efficiency rating, value over replacement player, and blocks plus minus. They made it all the way to Game 7 of the East Finals before they were eliminated by the Detroit Pistons. The next year, the Heat would not only get their revenge on the Pistons, but on the league as a whole, as they defeated Detroit in the East Finals and eventually the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA Finals. It's no question that Wade was clearly the best player in those finals with his historic performance, but Shaq still efficiently chipped in as he earned his fourth and final ring. After this season specifically, Shaq's athleticism and production would begin to decline dramatically, as his career wrapped up as a journeyman, traveling from team to team seeking one last opportunity at another championship ring. Unfortunately, that additional opportunity in the finals would never come. Many have criticized Shaq for not having the greatest work ethic and have harped on the fact that Shaq didn't have the greatest longevity because he didn't always maintain his fitness. Famously, analysts like Shannon Sharpe and even teammates like Kobe Bryant have perpetuated this narrative by being very harsh on O'Neal. The thing is, although I do believe there's some truth to it, I also believe that it's grossly exaggerated. Shaq played a total of 19 seasons in the NBA, which is an extremely high amount for a center, especially one of his size. On top of that, he was arguably the best center in the entire NBA for 14 straight seasons, and he had MVP votes in 14 of those 19 seasons while earning 15 All-Star selections. So honestly, I feel like people are nitpicking one of the greatest players of all time when they're criticizing Shaq's perceived lack of longevity. With an elite work ethic, at most, I think he gets another year or two of elite production, but that's it. When we look at his resume as a whole, Shaq made 14 All-NBA teams, 3 All-Defense teams, and was a 4-time NBA champion, a 3-time Finals MVP, the 2000 League MVP, and was the 1993 Rookie of the Year. He also led the league in field goal percentage 10 times, which is the most in NBA history, ahead of Wilt Chamberlain, and is double the amount of third place, which is DeAndre Jordan. He wasn't without any weakness though, as the Diesel famously struggled from the free throw line, shooting a career percentage of 52.7%. Shaq has always claimed that he made his free throws when his team needed them the most. But after much research, the statistics basically indicate that he shot roughly the same percentage regardless of what part of the game he was in. Rick Barry is among the people who offered to aid Shaquille O'Neal with his free throws, which would have involved Shaq learning an underhanded form for his foul shooting. Shaq boldly declined this offer simply for the reason that it looked ridiculous. It's unfortunate that Shaq was so prideful in this area, because if Shaq had actually been a great free throw shooter, then he likely would have finished his career as the consensus greatest player of all time. Regardless, all in all, Shaq is one of the greatest players of all time, and along with Michael Jordan and Bill Russell, he's easily one of the greatest NBA Finals performers that the league has ever seen. I want you guys to think about this for a second. Who has the most impressive resume of all the players who are rarely talked about? Honestly, I think this guy might be the winner of that category. Robert Lee Pettit Jr., more commonly referred to as Bob Pettit. He's an NBA Hall of Famer and one of the 75 greatest players of league history. This 6'9" power forward / center played in the NBA from 1954 to 1965. And in that time, he dominated the game to an extent that very few have before or since. He was drafted by the Hawks with the 2nd overall pick, and spent the entirety of his career with that team, as he is now recognized by many as the greatest player in franchise history. Some people believe he was the first stretch 4 in NBA history,
as he was extremely efficient with his perimeter jumpers. Based on that attribute alone, you would think that he was a finesse-style player, but that wasn't even close to being the case, as Pettit played with energy and intensity, and this resulted in him regularly dominating the boards. For his career, Pettit averaged an impressive 16.2 rebounds per game, and got as high as 20.3 in 1961. He had very few limitations, but one of them was his ball handling. He wasn't necessarily the best at creating a shot for himself, but he made up for it with his off-ball movement and with his relentless pursuit of second-chance opportunities. According to Oscar Robertson, Bob Pettit was one of the smartest forwards in the history of the game. And according to the legendary Bill Russell, Pettit was one of the most clutch players to ever live. Russell would know a thing or two about that because he actually battled Pettit many times on the game's biggest stage. One of those instances was in the 1958 NBA Finals, where Pettit's Hawks defeated Russell's Celtics in 6 games. In that championship-clinching 6th game, Pettit had a performance for the history books, as he dropped 50 points and 19 rebounds on 56% shooting from the field. According to Bill Russell, Bob Pettit scored 19 of the Hawks' final 21 points to clutchly secure the championship victory 110-109. To this day, that is the only championship in Hawks history, and that was the only time that Bill Russell's Celtics ever lost in the NBA Finals. Now, his best individual season statistically was probably in 1962, when he averaged a whopping 31 points, nearly 19 rebounds, and 4 assists on 45% shooting. His accolades seem to have no end, as Pettit was the first player in NBA history to reach 20,000 points. He was the All-Star Game MVP a record 4 times. He was an NBA All-Star in all 11 seasons of his career. He was the 1955 Rookie of the Year, the 1956 Rebounding Champion, he won 2 scoring titles, and he won 2 league MVPs. If there's one stat that truly emphasizes his consistent dominance, it's this one. In 8 out of the 11 seasons of his career, Pettit finished in the top 4 spots of the MVP voting. There was basically never a time where he wasn't abusing the opposition tremendously. Tim Duncan is usually recognized as the greatest power forward of all time, and the second spot is highly debated between a number of strong candidates. But I honestly believe that there's a decent argument that none of them are as deserving of that second spot as the one they call Big Blue, Bob Pettit.
It's no secret that Hakeem Olajuwon is one of the greatest centers of NBA history, but when you stack up his accomplishments to the accomplishments of other great centers of NBA history, you have a stronger argument than many realize for Hakeem to be considered the greatest all-around center of NBA history. Asking the question, how good was Hakeem Olajuwon really, may seem like a silly question with an obvious answer, which is pretty damn good. But in this series, we go a step beyond that and ask, where do these players rank among the greatest players of all time? Hakeem is one that's even better than advertised, and I'll prove it to you, the way I always try to do, by starting from the beginning of his career and traveling through the course of it as we appreciate his legacy. Olajuwon was selected with the first overall pick by the Houston Rockets in the 1984 draft. There was immediately lots of hype around this team, as fellow great big man Ralph Sampson was already on the Rockets roster. With the combination of the 7'4" Sampson and the 7-foot Olajuwon, the Rockets were expected to quickly become serious threats in the Western Conference, and that's exactly what they did, as they went from a 29-53 team to a 48-34 team after the addition of Olajuwon. As a 22-year-old in his rookie campaign, he averaged a stellar 20.6 points, 11.9 rebounds, and 2.7 blocks on 53.8% shooting while playing all 82 games. It was excellent enough to make the All-Star team in his very first season. Unfortunately for Hakeem, Michael Jordan was also a rookie that year, so Hakeem had to settle for runner-up for the Rookie of the Year award. Hakeem and Jordan were the only players that year to receive Rookie of the Year votes. Their season ultimately ended in the first round at the hands of the Utah Jazz, but in the following NBA season, they would shock the basketball world. Hakeem improved his scoring and defense with averages of 23.5 points, 11.5 rebounds, and 3.4 blocks on 52.6% shooting, leading his Rockets to a 51-31 record, but it would be in the playoffs where they would show what they were capable of.
In the first round, they swept the Sacramento Kings in 3 games. In the second round, they defeated the high-octane offense of the Denver Nuggets in 6 games. And in the Western Conference Finals, they shockingly upset the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers in only 5 games. It was a series that Olajuwon dominated, even with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar often defending him, as Hakeem averaged 31 points, 11.2 rebounds, 2.2 steals, and 4 blocks on 52% shooting. This was a 23-year-old in his sophomore season, dominating one of the greatest centers of all time in the Western Conference Finals. If people didn't realize how legendary Hakeem was going to be before this series took place, they certainly knew after it. Lakers head coach Pat Riley put it this way about defending Olajuwon: "We tried everything to stop him. We put 4 bodies on him, and we helped from different angles. He's just a great player." The Rockets ultimately lost in the NBA Finals to the 1986 Boston Celtics in 6 games, who are still considered one of the greatest teams of all time. But just the fact that the Rockets were even in that series was an impressive surprise, especially when you consider the fact that their 2 best players were only 23 and 25 years old. This team seemed destined to develop into NBA champions led by their Twin Towers. Sadly, they instead went on to become one of the great what-ifs of NBA history, as Sampson was dealing with severe knee issues over the next couple years, which would stop his development and eventually prematurely end his career. One can only wonder if Hakeem might have been able to win even more championships if Sampson had been healthy and available to develop alongside him. Instead, Hakeem would have to spend the prime of his career carrying the team as the lone superstar, but with his skills and overall talent, he was more than poised to do so. He had an extremely polished game for a big man and had easily the greatest footwork ever seen from the center position. He had an offensive and defensive IQ that was through the roof. He was a terrific leader who had all the post moves, the mid-range game, the fadeaways, hook shots, and so on. There was basically no answer for him. During the best stretch of his career, from 1986 to 1996, he averaged 24.7 points, 12.4 rebounds, and an absurd 3.7 blocks on 51.4% shooting. During that stretch, he led the league in rebounding twice, led the league in blocks 3 times, won 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, and won the MVP award in 1994. He also recorded a quadruple-double on March 29th of the 1990 season. His final stat line said 18 points, 16 rebounds, 10 assists, and 11 blocks in one of the greatest games of NBA history. Hakeem is one of only 4 players to ever record a quadruple-double. Think that's crazy? Well, it gets even crazier. Just 12 games before that quadruple-double, Hakeem had a game where he scored 29 points, 18 rebounds, 9 assists, and 11 blocks. No player in the history of the NBA has ever officially recorded multiple quadruple-doubles in their career, and Hakeem Olajuwon almost had 2 in the same month. You could argue that no player in league history ever filled up a stat sheet as much as Hakeem did. If he played in today's game, he would be a fantasy basketball monster. You could also make the argument that Hakeem Olajuwon is the greatest two-way player to ever live. Not only was he a great scorer, who was up close to 30 points a game during his prime, but he's also by far the all-time leader in block shots with a lead of almost 600 blocks. To help put that in perspective, Miles Turner led the league in block shots last season with a total of 199. That means Hakeem has a lead on the all-time list of nearly 3 seasons of league-leading blocks. No one else is even close. In the history of the NBA, only 10 players have won the Defensive Player of the Year award multiple times. Of those 10 players, no one averaged more points in his career than Hakeem Olajuwon, and once again, no one else is even close. With all of these stats, numbers, and achievements, you can begin to see how transcendent of a talent he was, but what people remember him for, more than anything, is the 2 championships he won in the mid-90s, and for good reason, because those were the times in the playoffs where he clearly stood out among his peers. During his runs in the 94 and 95 season, he dominated Patrick Ewing, Shaquille O'Neal, and David Robinson. Speaking of title runs, Hakeem had one of the greatest playoff series of all time in the 1995 Western Conference Finals. Up against him was David Robinson, who made 8 All-Defense teams over his career, won a Defensive Player of the Year award, and was that season's league MVP. And even he looked completely helpless against the Dream, as Hakeem averaged 35.3 points, 12.5 rebounds, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, and 4.2 blocks on 56% shooting. Talk about showing up the MVP. Has anyone ever done it more strongly than in this series? This 95 Rockets team was an underdog 6th-seeded team, that Olajuwon drugged to their second straight NBA championship. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it for a minute. When's the last time that a player could say that he won back-to-back championships as the lone all-star on his team? LeBron can't say that. Kobe can't say that. Neither can Jordan, Magic, Isaiah, or even Bill Russell. Hakeem Olajuwon is the only player in NBA history to win back-to-back NBA championships as the only all-star on his team. If that doesn't tell you how good this man was, absolutely nothing will. As far as where he ranks among the greatest centers of all time, you gotta put Wilt, Russell, and Kareem all ahead of him. But man, in my opinion, he's right there with Shaq. I'm even tempted to say he's ahead of Shaq. I know that's an extremely unpopular opinion, but I just feel like he dominated the game in more ways than Shaq did, from his overall skill set to his defense to the quadruple-double tendencies and so on. You also have to consider what they accomplished and who they had supporting them. Hakeem won 2 championships with no all-star support. If you give a prime Hakeem Olajuwon 8 years of a young and lethal Kobe Bryant, he's at least doubling his championship total. Throw in a year with Dwayne Wade, where he averaged 35 points in the NBA Finals, and it's a wrap. Hakeem's legacy becomes one that's out of this world. Gary Dwayne Payton, also known as the Glove for his ability to cover his opponents. According to basketball legend and Hall of Famer Gail Goodrich, Payton is probably the most complete guard the league has ever seen. Gary was drafted in 1990 with a second overall pick by the Seattle Supersonics. It was there that he built his legendary legacy. Unfortunately, he isn't often remembered and honored as often as he should be, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that his greatest days were with an organization that no longer exists. I mean, it kind of does. I understand that the Oklahoma City Thunder used to be the Seattle Supersonics, but the reality is they now play in a different city with a new fan base under a different name. His legacy just isn't going to be reflected upon as much as it would have been if the organization was still in Seattle. Regardless, today we're taking a moment to reflect on one of the greats of the game and answer the question of just how good was Gary Payton really? Let's start from the beginning. Payton had expectations upon entering the NBA, but he was a bit of a late bloomer. In his rookie campaign, he played 27 minutes a game and averaged just 7.2 points, 6.4 assists, and 3 rebounds on 45% shooting. The following year, his numbers were roughly the same, while just slightly increasing his scoring to about 9 points a game. It wasn't until he was 25 years old and entering his 4th year in the league that Payton began to break out as an elite player both offensively and defensively. With Payton coming into his own, alongside of the 6'10 slashing power forward Shawn Kemp, the Sonics soon became an elite basketball team. Before Blake Griffin and Chris Paul were being called Lob City for the Los Angeles Clippers, that's a title that could have belonged to the Payton and Kemp Seattle Supersonics, with Kemp often being on the receiving end of some exciting lob passes from Payton. Not only was this group an exciting fast break team under Payton's lead, but they were also incredibly sound and elite defensively. With this formula, the Sonics went deep into the playoffs several times, like in 1993 when they came just short of the NBA Finals, losing to Charles Barkley's Phoenix Suns in Game 7 of the West Finals. Their best team, though, was easily the 95-96 Supersonics, who were the second best team defensively that season and finished with a 64-18 record through the regular season. The only thing wrong with this group was their timing, because the 95-96 Bulls were on their 72-10 season and are still often considered the greatest team of all time. Remember I said the Sonics were the second best team defensively in 96? Well, they were only behind the 72-10 Bulls that season. Regardless of the fact that they were facing the greatest team of all time in the finals, they still put up a fantastic fight, pushing the Bulls to 6 games. Leading that charge was Gary Payton, who took on the assignment of taking on the world's greatest player in that series, and Gary slowed down MJ like no one else could. Jordan averaged just 27 points that series on a notably inefficient 41.5% shooting. Sure, 27 points a game might seem like a lot, but the truth is, in every other NBA Finals Jordan was in, he averaged comfortably over 30 points per game, while usually shooting above 50% from the field. I get that MJ still won the championship and was still the Finals MVP, but with that being said, no one has ever defended Michael Jordan on the biggest stage as well as Gary Payton did, and that's regardless of the fact that Gary is a couple inches shorter than Jordan. That's a testament to Gary's defense overall that season, as he was the 1996 Defensive Player of the Year. In all of NBA history, Gary Payton is the only point guard to ever win the Defensive Player of the Year award. Gary would also let you hear about it as he shut you down, as he's often recognized as one of the greatest trash talkers in NBA history. During Payton's best stretch of his career, from 1993 to 2003, he averaged 20.8 points, 7.9 assists, 4.5 rebounds, and 2.1 steals on 47% shooting from the field, while usually being the best defensive player on the floor. During that 10-year stretch, he was an All-Star 9 out of those 10 years, and he was first-team All-Defense 9 out of those 10 years, meaning that he was the best defender at his position for nearly a decade straight. His 9 first-team All-Defense selections is the most in NBA history, tied with 3 other players. It's also worth mentioning that load management was not a thing for Gary Payton. Despite the fact that he was often their leading scorer and facilitator while shutting down the opponent's best player just about every night, Payton still never took any voluntary breaks. In his 17-year career, he played in 1,335 games and only missed a grand total of 27 games due to injury. He was a flat-out baller, hard worker, and an Iron Man of a player. It wasn't until the 2005-2006 season with the Miami Heat that Gary Payton finally secured that elusive championship as a part of the Shaq and Wade Miami Heat. Payton had reduced numbers at that point of his career, but people often forget that he was still a key contributing role player to that championship team. So just how good was Gary Payton really? Well, honestly, it just depends on how much you value the defensive end of the floor, which is literally half of the game. Sure, Gary was pretty good on the offensive end at both scoring and facilitating, but in terms of defense, Payton is easily the greatest point guard of all time on that end of the floor. Today, we're talking about a player with one of the most polarizing legacies of all time, the legacy of Scottie Maurice Pippen. You guys know plenty about Pippen's legacy. He was one of the greatest wing defenders the league has ever seen. He was a capable scorer and a perennial All-Star and a 6-time NBA champion. So you may be asking yourself, why even bother making this video if we already know so much about Scottie Pippen? The reason why I think this video is necessary is because no one seems to agree on the greatness of Scottie Pippen. He's one of the most difficult players to rank on the all-time list. Some say he's extremely underrated, while others say he's grossly overrated. In 1997, Scottie Pippen was voted by NBA representatives as one of the 50 greatest players of all time, but even this sparked plenty of debates and controversy, because some felt he wasn't as worthy of that honor as some of Pippen's peers. There's one thing we can blame for the confusion on the greatness of Scottie Pippen, and that is the shadow of Michael Jordan. The instant you bring up Pippen within a conversation about the greatest players of all time, there will be people who look at you funny and who will quickly dismiss him, because obviously Jordan deserved most of the credit and was the leader of those championship teams. Because Scottie was the Robin to Jordan's Batman, it's hard for people to clearly see Pippen's true greatness or lack thereof. He was a sidekick, and during his prime, we almost never got to see him outside of his role as a sidekick. With that being said, Pippen is easily the most accomplished sidekick of all time. In this video, I'll be tackling the career of Scottie Pippen and taking an in-depth look at his stats and his game so that we may finally and definitively come to a conclusion on just how great Scottie Pippen actually was. Let's take it back to the beginning of Scottie's career. Scottie Pippen was entering the NBA draft in the 1987 season, coming off of a senior year at the University of Central Arkansas, a season in which Scottie averaged 23.6 points, 10 rebounds, 4.3 assists on near 60% field goal shooting. He was selected 5th overall in the 1987 NBA draft by the Seattle Supersonics and was traded to the Chicago Bulls for Olden Polynice and future draft pick options. On a quick side note, the Supersonics really blew it with this trade because on their roster, they had offensive-minded all-stars like Tom Chambers, Dale Ellis, and Xavier McDaniel, who were all in their mid to late 20s. Adding a defensive anchor like Scottie Pippen almost certainly would have made them perennial contenders in the Western Conference. Instead, Pippen started his career in Chicago with an already established Michael Jordan who was in the middle of an MVP season. Pippen's career actually got off to a slow start and needed to develop his game over time. He only played 20 minutes per game in his first year and didn't start a single game for the Bulls, averaging only 7.9 points, 3.8 rebounds, and 2.1 assists per game. Regardless of the slow start, the coaching staff and Pippen's peers still saw great potential in the young small forward. The obsessively competitive Michael Jordan specifically matched up with Scottie during most of the Bulls' practices. Throughout the years, many have credited Pippen's strong development, both offensively and defensively, to Jordan pushing him in those early years of Bulls practices. The maturation was slowly starting to show. In his second season, Scottie started 56 games on 33 minutes per game while increasing his averages to 14.4 points, 6.1 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game on 47.6% shooting. With Scottie's help, Jordan and the Bulls reached the 1989 Eastern Semifinals for the first time in over a decade for the franchise. Unfortunately, Jordan and Pippen were not ready to dethrone the star-studded Pistons and were eliminated 4-2. It wasn't until Scottie's third season that he really started to break out into a star. He played and started all 82 games for the Bulls, earning his first All-Star selection of his career, while again increasing his averages to 16.5 points, 6.7 rebounds, and 5.4 assists and 2.6 steals per game on 49% shooting. Pippen was now beginning to realize his potential, and with Jordan having his first All-Star supporting teammate of his career, the Bulls looked poised to finally defeat their bitter rival, the Detroit Pistons, in the playoffs. The teams met in the 1990 Eastern Conference Finals, and it was an epic series that was to be decided in the 7th game of the series. Unfortunately, Scottie was dealing with a severe migraine heading into the deciding game, an issue that had labored him for several times in his career. Pippen had decided to play and try to push through the pain, but it would have been better if he didn't. Pippen was clearly not himself in the deciding game and shot a horrendous 1 for 10 from the field. The Bulls never stood a chance, losing the game 93-74. The following season was Pippen's best yet. He increased his averages again, scoring 17.8 points, 7.3 rebounds, led the team in assists with 6.2, and averaged 2.4 steals on a very efficient 52% from the field. This was also the first season Pippen was recognized as one of the elite defenders in the league, as he made the NBA second team all-defense. His team-leading 6.2 assists was also a correlation of his prominent and growing role within Phil Jackson's triangle offense, as Pippen was the team's main facilitator from the perimeter. With Pippen now beginning to reach his potential, Jordan had all the help he needed, and the Bulls destroyed the rival Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, sweeping them 4-0. The Bulls went on to defeat the Lakers in the 1991 NBA Finals, winning their first championship in what was the beginning of a dynasty. Scottie Pippen would be an All-Star the next 6 straight years. He went on to make a total of 10 all-defense team selections, lead the leagues in steals for a season, and won his famous 6 championship rings. During his time as a Chicago Bull, Scottie was always a supporter to Michael Jordan's Batman, except for one small sample size of a season and a half. This sample should weigh heavily on how we define Scottie Pippen's legacy. At the end of the Bulls' first three-peat in the 1993 season, Jordan announced his retirement from basketball in order to pursue his love for baseball. In Jordan's absence, Pippen emerged from his shadow. That year, he earned All-Star Game MVP honors and led the Bulls in scoring, assists, and blocks, and was second in the NBA in steals per game, averaging 22 points, 8.7 rebounds, 5.6 assists, 2.9 steals, and 0.8 blocks per game while shooting 49.1% from the field. For his efforts, he He earned the first of 3 straight All-NBA first-team selections, and he finished 3rd in the MVP voting. The Bulls had made key additions that season of Tony Kukoc, Steve Kerr, and Luke Longley, and had finished the Jordanless season with 55 wins, good enough for the 3rd best record in the Eastern Conference. Pippen had taken the reins as leader of the defending champion Chicago Bulls, and he wasn't just doing a good job, but an excellent one. The Bulls comfortably swept the Cavaliers in the first round of the playoffs, and that set them up with a matchup with their physical rivals, the New York Knicks. Pippen continued to lead the Bulls through the series, and although Pippen produced quality averages of 22 points, 8 rebounds, and 5 assists, the Knicks' physical defense was clearly affecting his efficiency as he shot only 40% from the field that series. The two teams battled hard deep into the series, and in the 6th game, Pippen made the most iconic moment of his career. Midway through the 3rd quarter, Pippen was on a fast break, charging towards the basket as center Patrick Ewing jumped up to defend him. Pippen utterly posterized Ewing, absorbing contact and a foul, and slammed the ball through the hoop. Pippen proceeded to walk over the destroyed Ewing. He then taunted both Ewing and iconic Knicks fan Spike Lee, who was standing courtside. Pippen received a technical foul for the taunting, but it was worth the moment. That has since been immortalized in the great moments of playoff history. The Bulls handily won the game, pushing the series to a 7th game. In the 7th game, Pippen scored 20 points and added a monstrous 16 rebounds, but ultimately didn't receive enough help, and the Bulls were eliminated 87-77. Despite the MVP caliber season from Pippen, trade rumors were swirling the following season. The rumors involved the potential trade that would send Pippen to the Supersonics for Shawn Kemp. During the 94-95 season, Pippen was asked in an interview if he thought he'd be traded, to which Pippen responded, "I hope I am." You see, the Bulls were dominant in the 90s as we all know, but there was certainly no shortage of drama between the players and Jerry Krause, the team's general manager. That's another video I'll make down the road. But what's important here is that Jerry and Pippen were both sick of one another, and with the Bulls struggling that season after the loss of Horace Grant in free agency, Pippen was ready to split. That is, until Jordan announced his plans to return to the team late into the season. After Jordan rejoined the team, the Bulls were soon returning to their winning ways, but not without Pippen first validating himself as an MVP candidate and making some history too. At the end of the 1994-95 season, Pippen led his team in every major statistical category: points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals. In the entirety of NBA history, only 4 other players have accomplished that feat: Dave Cowens, Kevin Garnett, LeBron James, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. That's some pretty damn historic company. After seeing the totality of Pippen's accomplishments, I think it's fair to see why he's easily one of the 50 greatest ever. In the small sample size without Jordan, Pippen was an MVP candidate. He's one of the greatest defenders ever, he's a great all-around player, and he was a great facilitator for the Bulls. Pippen was a reliable and capable scorer, but he was never a pure dominant scorer. Pippen was always an offensive player who played within the flow and system of his team's offense, but he wasn't the type of player who often erupted in hot scoring bursts. Even in Pippen's lone full season without Jordan, Pippen's shot attempts per game only increased a little over 1 shot a game over the previous season with Jordan. He never averaged over 22 points per game and never shot more than 18 shots per game. But other than not being quite a transcendent scorer, Pippen was remarkable in just about every other aspect of his game. Honestly, the player who reminds me the most of Scottie Pippen in today's game is Kawhi Leonard, and I don't believe that to be a knock on either player, but each player should find that flattering. Both were pretty good scorers, they had a similar height, build, and playing style. Both started slow in their careers, but matured in their game by leaps and bounds throughout the years. Both were also all-time great defenders. To me, the type of career Kawhi Leonard had had so far is the type of career Scottie Pippen could have had if he had never played alongside Michael Jordan. Despite this video, I'm sure Scottie Pippen will continue to have a legacy that sparks plenty of debate. Let me know in the comment section if you agree or disagree, and just how good you believe Scottie Pippen actually was.
David Maurice Robinson, also known as the Admiral. Robinson was a lean and strong 7'1" center who was a force on both sides of the basketball. His greatest days were throughout the 90s, where it was easy to sometimes be overshadowed amidst all of the elite bigs at the time. In Robinson's prime, he had to compete in the paint with the likes of Shaq, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, Alonzo Mourning, and Dikembe Mutombo. Despite the stiff competition, David managed to put up some incredible numbers over his career, worthy of the Basketball Hall of Fame. But the question is, just how good was Robinson really? Where does he rank among the great centers of his era, and among the greatest centers of all time? To answer that question, let's start at the beginning of his career. Robinson was drafted in 1987 with the first overall pick by the San Antonio Spurs. Unfortunately for the Spurs, Robinson was still serving in the US Navy, and the team had to wait 2 years before Robinson would actually make his debut with the organization. Turns out the wait was well worth it. Robinson's 1989 rookie campaign is still one of the greatest rookie seasons in NBA history. The year before Robinson made his debut for San Antonio, the Spurs were terrible and were the third worst team in the league with a record of 21-61. There were several major additions following that ugly season, but the biggest one was the 24-year-old rookie they called the Admiral. And under his leadership and impact, the Spurs made what was at the time the greatest improvement in NBA history, going from a 21-61 team to an elite 56-26 team, which was good enough for the third best record in the Western Conference. When you take a look at Robinson's numbers that year, it's pretty clear how the Spurs were able to make such an improvement. As a rookie, he played all 82 games, averaged 24.3 points, 12 rebounds, and an absurd 3.9 blocks per game while shooting 53% from the field. He led the team all the way to the Western Conference semifinals, where they ultimately lost in 7 games to the Western Conference champion Portland Trail Blazers. From that point on, Robinson's monstrous career wasn't looking back. From 1989 to 1996, he averaged 25.6 points, 11.8 rebounds, and 3.6 blocks on 53% shooting, and he was an all-star each of those years. He started piling up accolades as well. In 1991, he was the rebounds champion. In 1992, he was the Defensive Player of the Year while averaging a historic 4.5 blocks per game. That's the 7th highest single-season average in NBA history. With a block per game average that high, imagine how many shots he altered that season. He's basically the definition of the ideal rim protector. He was a scoring champion in 1994, averaging 29.8 points per game, and he was the league MVP in 1995. He was arguably the best big man on both sides of the ball during his prime. Year in and year out, he was in the discussion, although of course there were times other bigs got the best of him. The biggest example of this was in the 1995 Western Conference Finals between Hakeem's Rockets and Robinson's Spurs. Hakeem was out of his mind that series and averaged 35 points, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, and 4.2 blocks, while Robinson just put up his usual numbers. Many have used this series as a criticism to Robinson's legacy, but I honestly think that's a bit ridiculous. Hakeem is a top 5 center of all time. Him having a historic performance over another great center should be more of a praise to Hakeem than it is a criticism to his opponent. In the years after that, Robinson looked to bounce back, but a back injury early in the 1997 season made that difficult. He missed most of that season, but eventually returned to play in just 6 regular season games before he then broke his foot. His championship hopes seemed to be over, with the Spurs finishing as a 20-62 team that year. Oddly enough, this actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Thanks to that poor season, they had a spot in the draft lottery, and they struck gold by landing the first overall pick, which then became the legendary Tim Duncan. Robinson now had the second superstar he needed to break through, and in only their second season together, they won the 1999 NBA championship. He won his second championship in the 2003 season. At this point, Robinson was only making a small contribution of 8 points and 8 rebounds,
but under Duncan's lead, it was enough to get it done once again. Robinson's championships came in the twilight of his career, but his accolades came earlier on when he appeared to be one of the most dominant two-way players in NBA history. A prime Robinson could basically do it all, and no game better symbolized that than on February 17, 1994 against the Detroit Pistons. In this contest, David had 34 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, and 10 blocks, giving him the illustrious quadruple-double. In the history of the NBA, only 4 players have ever recorded a quadruple-double, and Robinson is the most recent instance when he did it 25 years ago. In total, he was a 10-time All-Star, made 10 All-NBA teams, and made 8 All-Defense teams to go along with his MVP, Defensive Player of the Year award, and his 2 NBA championships. He was an elite scorer, rebounder, and defender, and he has the 4th highest career blocks per game average of all time. If you're in a discussion about the greatest centers of NBA history, you'll hear the usual names, like Russell, Chamberlain, Kareem, Shaq, and Hakeem. That's a solid top 5. But if Robinson isn't one of the next 2 names you add to that list, well then quite frankly, that's a crime in my mind.
Let's start this one off by getting a couple things out of the way. Rodman was not a scorer. He couldn't really shoot the ball, and in only one season of his career did he average double-digit scoring. Although he could run the fast break, and if you weren't careful, he could dunk on you to finish the play. Rodman was also a liability from the free throw line. Before the hack-a-shack was a thing, people were hacking Rodman to send him to the free throw line late in games, as he shot an atrocious 58.4% from the free throw line over his career. Despite these flaws, anyone would love to have a prime Rodman on their team due to everything else he brought to the table. He was called the Freak for a reason. Rodman was a transcendent athlete. Phil Jackson described Dennis Rodman as the greatest athlete he's ever coached. Not Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, or Scottie Pippen. Dennis Rodman. It makes sense from the standpoint that Rodman was strong, quick, had incredible leaping ability, and had the stamina to run at 110% capacity all season long. What Rodman was known for more than anything else was his rebounding dominance. Just how dominant? Well, Dennis Rodman actually had a legitimate argument for the title of greatest rebounder in NBA history, or at the very least in recent NBA history. Standing at 6 foot 7 inches tall, pound for pound, inch for inch, he is easily the greatest rebounder of all time. He's ranked only 23rd all time on the NBA rebounds list, but this has a lot to do with the fact that Rodman was only 25 years old when he was a rookie in the NBA, which is by far older than everyone else ahead of him on the list. If you happen to think Dennis Rodman's rebound numbers were inflated because of the era he played in, you might be surprised to find out it's actually the opposite. This past 2019 NBA season, the league average for team rebounds per game was 45.2. That's the most rebounds per game since the 1970s. In the modern NBA, the pace of the game has quickened, which means that more shots are going up and more rebounds are up for grabs. In the 1996-97 season, the pace of the game was much slower and teams were averaging only 41.1 rebounds per game. That's the second fewest rebounds for a season in NBA history. Despite some of the fewest opportunities at rebounds in league history, Rodman still led the league in rebounds that season with an incredible 16.1 boards per game. Despite the faster pace in the modern era of basketball, no player since 1997 has averaged as many rebounds per game as Rodman did in the 96-97 season. The year that Rodman averaged 16.1 boards per game, Dikembe Mutombo was the runner-up, averaging almost a whole 5 rebounds less than Rodman that year. Also keep in mind that Mutombo was also 7 inches taller than Dennis Rodman, and yet he wasn't even close to him in rebounds. In the 1991-92 season, Rodman had his greatest year in rebounds, averaging an all-time great 18.7 boards per game. That year, the league average for team rebounds was right around what it typically is at 43.7 per game. If you want to go back to a time in NBA history where players were averaging as many rebounds as Rodman, you would have to go back to the late 1970s and the 1960s. Players were exceeding Rodman's rebound numbers during that era, but that had a lot to do with the fact that the pace of the game was way quicker during that era, and players were also missing way more shots then, as it was the lowest field goal efficiency seasons in NBA history. During the 60s to the late 70s, teams were averaging between 51 and 73 rebounds per game. That's an insane statistical advantage compared to the team averages in the low 40s during Rodman's playing days. The point being that regardless of what year you drop a prime Rodman in, he is going to destroy the league with his rebounding numbers due to his freakishly athletic ability, his strength, and his motor to give 110% all game long. And again, Dennis was only 6 foot 7 inches tall. Can you imagine if Dennis was born with a 7-foot frame? How many rebounds would he have hauled in if that was the case? Rebounding was also only a part of Rodman's game. He also had all-time great defense, appearing in 8 all-defense teams, and he won 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. His defensive game also evolved throughout the years. In his early years with the Pistons, he was a more perimeter defender, as he had a leaner frame, with the quickness and agility to keep up with the best and fastest wing players the league had to offer. In his later years with the Bulls, Rodman put on a lot of muscle and was able to lock up some of the best power forwards and centers in the game. Rodman, at one point or another, was a lockdown defender for all of the 5 positions on the court. In the 1995 season, Jordan and Pippen's Chicago Bulls were eliminated from the playoffs by the Orlando Magic, led by Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, and Horace Grant. 1 year later, the Bulls swept that same Magic team out of the 1996 playoffs. So what changed? Well, one of the biggest contributing factors was the addition of Dennis Rodman to the Bulls roster. His interior impact was felt, as he was tasked with guarding Shaq down low. Rodman also killed Shaq on the boards that series, with an average of 15.8 rebounds per game compared to Shaq's 10.8. In later years when Shaq was a Laker, Rodman had stretches where he completely shut down the big man and held him scoreless late in games. If Shaq has 6 inches and almost 100 pounds of an advantage on you, and you're still able to shut him down for stretches, then you know you're an all-time great defender. Rodman wasn't the most gifted offensively, but he's one of the best ever at rebounding and defending. Let's be honest, when you spend your career with scoring assassins like Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars, and then scoring slashers like Jordan and Pippen, rebounding and defense is basically all you need.
So there are 5 major statistical categories in basketball. There's points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and steals. And this player by far is the all-time leader in not 1, but 2 of those statistical categories. John Stockton. He has a lead of over 3,700 assists over second place on the all-time list, which is Jason Kidd. To put that in context, Russell Westbrook leads the NBA in assists this past season with a total of 784. That means that Stockton has a lead greater than 4 league-leading seasons of assists. No one else is even close. Stockton also has a lead of nearly 600 steals over second place on the all-time list, which again is Jason Kidd. Paul George led this season in steals with 170, meaning Stockton has a lead of nearly 4 league-leading seasons of steals. He was arguably the greatest passer in NBA history and was an all-time tenacious defender, yet for some reason, John Stockton's name is not brought up much when discussing the greatest point guards of all time. This simply shouldn't be the case. He was a 10-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA team, 5-time All-Defensive team, and an Olympic gold medalist as part of the 1992 Dream Team. John was an Iron Man and the model of consistency for many years throughout his NBA career. The best ability is availability, and John certainly had that. He played a total of 1,504 games, and he only missed a total of 23 of those games due to injury. In Stockton's 19 years as a point guard of the Utah Jazz, there was not a single season they missed the NBA playoffs. In a minimum of 400 games, John Stockton is one of only 2 players in NBA history to average over 10 assists for his career, and the other being Magic Johnson. Of the 6 highest total assist seasons in NBA history, John Stockton has 5 of them. To even further examine how great and unrecognized John's remarkable career was, take a look at this comparison.
At the end of the 04-05 season, the Phoenix Suns starting point guard Steve Nash was named the MVP of the league with averages of 15.5 points, 11.5 assists, 3.3 rebounds, 1 steal on 50.2% shooting. John Stockton was never named league MVP, yet in the 87-88 season, he had a seemingly more productive season than Nash's with 14.7 points, 13.8 assists, 2.9 rebounds, 3 steals on an insanely efficient 57.4% shooting. The following season, he averaged 17.1, 13.6, 3 rebounds, 3.2 steals on 53.8%. And the season after that, 17.2, 14.5, 2.6, 2.7 on 51.4%. And the season after that, 17.2, 14.2, 2.9, 2.9 on 50.7% shooting. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Stockton had a career full of MVP caliber seasons, yet he was never recognized as the league's MVP. So just what exactly caused John Stockton to be so overlooked historically? Why is it that he was the all-time leader in assists and steals, consistently put up MVP caliber numbers, and yet is still rarely mentioned when considering who is the greatest point guard of all time? I think there is a few reasons for this. For one, John Stockton was a reserved personality who played in a small market, so naturally he didn't garner as much media attention. Before there was Tim Duncan, there was John Stockton. I'm talking about NBA legends who, despite their incredible abilities, were less recognized in the spotlight due to their quiet and reserved personalities in smaller markets. The second reason, whether it's fair or not, is that when speaking about NBA legacies, in the eyes of the general public, nothing validates a legacy quite like an NBA championship. And unfortunately, John Stockton never got one. Think of Dirk Nowitzki and his championship with the Mavericks in 2011. It was that series and that championship that the perception of Dirk changed, from simply an elite player to an all-time great. That series, when they succeeded over LeBron and the Miami Heat in 2011, cemented his legacy. Nothing can change the fact that Dirk is an NBA champion, and now he is a legend that will never be forgotten or overlooked, like he might have been if he had not won that championship. Then there are players like Charles Barkley in the 90s and Dominique Wilkins in the 80s, who, despite being statistically dominant and elite players throughout their careers, just don't get the same credit and recognition when discussing the greatest players of all time. Unfortunately, Stockton also falls into this category. Although he never won an NBA championship, he was close in 97 and 98, but the Jazz ran into arguably the greatest NBA team ever in the finals, the Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman Chicago Bulls. Stockton was a championship caliber player, but he spent all of his years playing faithfully for the Jazz who drafted him. John didn't have the luxury of having multiple Hall of Famers by his side like Magic Johnson did. Stockton only played with one Hall of Famer in his career, which was Karl Malone. And thirdly, Stockton is less recognized because he simply wasn't flashy. John was known for consistently making the right basketball play, but that didn't always mean it was the more entertaining one. He wasn't consistently making no-look passes like Magic was, and he certainly wasn't playing above the rim like Jordan was. In fact, even when the Jazz highlights were being shown, it was his teammate Karl Malone who was the one finishing the highlight above the rim. John simply went about his job, quietly filling up the stat sheet on both sides of the court. When he announced his retirement from basketball, there was no tribute video, no farewell tour, or even the customary press conference. Nope, he simply and quietly released a statement in the 2003 offseason. As overlooked as he has been, his resume simply can't be denied, solidifying him as one of the greatest point guards of all time. Those of you who like to use a player's longevity and accumulative statistics to make your GOAT comparisons, for example, those of you who believe LeBron James is the greatest of all time based on his high rankings and statistics, I have to ask, where have you been when it comes to ranking the greatest point guards of all time? Because Stockton is the clear number one based on that standard. I'm not necessarily saying that John Stockton is the greatest point guard ever, but he certainly has an argument that is rarely acknowledged, and hopefully this video sheds light on some of the credit his terrific career deserves.
When we talk about the most legendary players of the 1980s, usually 3 players are the first names to get brought up: Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and a young Michael Jordan. And although those players should be the first names to come up, There's another star who should be mentioned in that group, but sometimes gets overlooked. Isaiah Lord Thomas. Nowadays, when you hear people talk about the greatest point guards of all time, you'll hear a few names come up. Obviously, Magic Johnson still stands on top, but after him, you'll hear people mention Steph Curry, John Stockton, or even Allen Iverson in some cases. But if you ask me, there's no player more deserving of the second spot on the all-time point guards list than Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah was one of the clutchest performers in NBA history. Not only was he a two-time champion and a finals MVP, but he had numerous legendary moments in the playoffs where he simply took over the game. Like in the 1984 playoffs against the Knicks in a pivotal fifth game, where Isaiah dropped a whopping 16 points in the final 94 seconds of the fourth quarter, forcing the crucial game into overtime. Or how about Game 6 of the 1988 NBA Finals against the Lakers? Minutes into the third quarter of a close game, and Isaiah severely sprains his ankle. He appears as if he could barely stand, but Isaiah, being the fierce competitor that he is, stayed in the game and basically played on one foot. Despite the fact that he was playing through pain and on a swollen ankle, Isaiah caught fire and carried the Pistons on his back. He set an NBA Finals record that still stands today with an amazing 25 points in a single quarter. And once again, he did that on a severely sprained ankle. Isaiah ended the game with an incredible 43 points, 8 assists, 6 steals on 56% shooting from the field. Many people remember Michael Jordan's legendary flu game in the 1997 NBA Finals. But if you ask me, this game from Isaiah Thomas on a bad ankle was the most heroic finals performance in NBA history. Guys don't drop 25 points in a single quarter of the NBA Finals, especially when the player can barely even walk right due to an injury. But that's just the kind of player that Isaiah Thomas was. Isaiah in many ways was so ahead of his time. He had an extremely high usage rate and often operated as the focal point of the Pistons' offense. He was a small and shifty guard who could facilitate, could score from the perimeter, and could finish even when challenged in the painted area. He was also one of the greatest ball handlers of all time, with the ability to create space with his agility and misdirection. One thing Isaiah doesn't have is longevity and the all-time statistics because of how short his career was. He battled with ankle injuries throughout his career, and his final season was cut short due to a torn Achilles. Isaiah was only 32 years old when he played his final game in the NBA. So what I'm essentially saying is that the overall career numbers of Isaiah Thomas don't accurately reflect his greatness. When Isaiah was on his game, he was an all-time great and one of the baddest dudes in the league. Isaiah had the numbers, the success, and the skills to be talked about among the all-time greats. But when people talk about Magic, Bird, and Michael, they often don't include Isaiah, even though they should. Why? Well, if you ask me, I think it's simply because Isaiah doesn't fit the poster child image that the NBA is going for. Isaiah was the leader of the violent bad boy Pistons. He said things about Magic Johnson that spread rumors Magic didn't appreciate, and in another instance, he said some racial comments about Larry Bird that sparked a media reaction and a press conference. He just simply wasn't the most well-liked guy to a lot of people, and the NBA didn't advertise him like he was. Whether it's from his team's unpopular and violent style of play or from comments he made that tarnished his image a bit, Isaiah simply doesn't get the recognition he deserves based on his incredible talent. Here's an example. Michael Jordan's flu game is legendary and referenced often in the NBA community, but Isaiah Thomas's 25 points in the single quarter of the NBA Finals on a bum ankle is simply treated like an afterthought. Why is this? Because one player is more marketable than the other. Imagine if Jordan had a game where he dropped 25 points in a single quarter on a bad ankle of the NBA Finals on the NBA's biggest stage. If MJ had been the one who did that, people in sports media would bring up that performance just about every day. In my last How Good Was He Really video, I compared Scottie Pippen's game to Kawhi Leonard. But in this video, it's honestly hard to compare Isaiah Thomas to a modern player because he was truly so unique. Isaiah was the best ball handler in the game at the time, and he was an elite facilitator and could be an elite scorer when he needed to be. When you hear people talk about a player's play style, they'll often describe a player as a score-first player or a pass-first player. For example, Rajon Rondo is clearly a pass-first type player, while Steph Curry is a shoot-first type player. You can't really put Isaiah into either of these categories, though, because he was so well balanced and so good at doing both. For example, no other player in NBA history ever averaged over 13 assists a game for a season while averaging over 20 points per game. That was Isaiah Thomas in his prime. He was one of the greatest dual threats the NBA had ever seen. If I had to compare him to a player from recent history, I would say Isaiah was like Chris Paul in his prime during his New Orleans days, but on steroids. He was an undersized and intelligent point guard and an elite ball handler just like CP3. He could score and facilitate with the best of them, just like the prime Chris Paul, and they were both fierce competitors. The thing that really separates their greatness, though, was Isaiah's ability to raise his game when it mattered most. Isaiah was clutch, and you could never relax on defense against him in the meaningful games, because you knew Isaiah was coming at you with the best he had to offer.
Dwayne Tyrone Wade. This 6'4" shooting guard was famously nicknamed Flash, and for good reason, as he was remarkably dynamic and a fast superstar during his prime. But just how good was he really? Some think Wade is a top 3 shooting guard in NBA history, while others think that that's way overblown. Lately, there's been a debate on who's the greater 2 guard, James Harden or Dwayne Wade. So where do I stand on all of this? I vividly remember the ups and downs of Wade's career, so I'll do my best to articulate his greatness during his playing days, compared to how he's generally perceived in the modern day. So without further ado, let's get into it. Dwayne Wade was selected in the 2003 NBA draft with the 5th overall pick by the Miami Heat. Sure, he was fully expected to be a talented player within the league, but at the time, almost all of the draft hype and excitement was centered around LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony. With that being said, Wade wouldn't take very long to start putting his name on the map. Many people never realized this, but Wade actually played his rookie season as the starting point guard for the Heat, as traditional shooting guard Eddie Jones was operating as his fellow backcourt teammate. As a 22-year-old, Wade had a solid rookie season as he averaged 16 points, 4.5 assists, and 4 rebounds on 46.5% shooting. It is worth mentioning that his assist-to-turnover ratio wasn't all that great, which was one of the first major indicators that he was likely out of position by starting at point guard. Fortunately, Miami made the adjustment, as he was then starting as shooting guard for his sophomore season. But that wasn't the only major change for the Miami Heat in Wade's second year. In an absolute blockbuster trade, the Heat acquired Shaquille O'Neal from the Los Angeles Lakers, solidifying a contending tandem in Miami. Right as the Diesel arrived, Wade conveniently took his game to the next level, as he put up averages of 24, 7, and 5 in his second year in the league. Now the speed and explosiveness of Wade was fully on display, as he was quickly putting everyone on notice that he was one of the best slashers in the game. Along with that, Wade began to stand out defensively, as he's one of the greatest shot-blocking guards in the history of the NBA, right there with Michael Jordan. In fact, Wade has the most blocked shots in NBA history by any player who was 6'4" or shorter, and honestly, it isn't even close, as the nearest defender is the Celtics Hall of Famer Dennis Johnson, who was behind Wade by more than 200 blocks. For his career, Wade made a total of 3 All-Defense teams, and frankly, this is one of the biggest reasons why I believe the comparisons to James Harden are so insane, because Wade was an all-time great two-way player, while Harden is completely a one-way player, who isn't even elite offensively in the postseason. On the other hand, the postseason is where Wade made a name for himself, and earned the respect of the basketball world. After nearly reaching the NBA Finals in 2005, Wade and the Heat broke through in 2006, squaring off with Dirk Nowitzki and the Dallas Mavericks. After falling behind 0-2 in the series, Wade went on an absolute tear, leading the Heat to win the next 4 games straight, with some of the greatest finals performances of league history. Now, many claim that this series was rigged, due to the insane amount of free throws that Wade shot throughout the series, especially in Game 5, where Wade alone took as many free throws as the entire Mavericks team. With that being said, there is the argument that Wade was simply the most aggressive player on the court, and his constant driving to the basket warranted that many free throw attempts. Regardless of where you stand on this topic, it's indisputable that Wade took his game to the next level when the games mattered the most, and because of this, he was rewarded with his first and only Finals MVP of his career. This was obviously the height of Wade's career as a superstar, but what many people forget is that things were quite rough for him after this point for a couple of seasons. Starting in the 06-07 season, Wade started having serious shoulder injuries. After he dislocated his shoulder in February of 2007, it would never stop to be a reoccurring issue that would flare up if he wasn't careful. On top of that, his knee started to become an issue as well, which began to hinder some of his quickness and explosiveness. Following the championship run in 2006, his career turned into a bit of a roller coaster, as he was clearly one of the best players in the league, but he was also missing a significant amount of each season, thanks to his shoulder issues and his knee surgeries. Many people believe these injuries kept Wade from taking his career to the next level, but no one believes that more than Dwayne Wade himself, who was on record saying that he would have been in the GOAT conversation if it wasn't for the injuries. After some turmoil, Wade finally had a mostly healthy year, which was the 08-09 regular season, and on an individual level, it was almost certainly the greatest season of his career, as he averaged a league-leading 30 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, and 2 steals, on 49% shooting. With a subpar supporting cast, Wade was able to lead his team to a playoff berth, and although LeBron James won the regular season MVP that year, many people believed that it should have gone to Wade. Although he had already pushed through some career-altering injuries, Flash displayed some of his best abilities this season. Many people have seemed to have forgotten just how great Wade was when it came to finishing around the rim. Nowadays, a lot of people argue whether Michael Jordan or Kyrie Irving have the greatest layup package of all time. But Wade certainly belongs in that conversation, as his acrobatic conversions were basically a nightly occurrence in his prime. With Shaq's departure long in the past, and with just a mediocre supporting cast, Wade wouldn't be competing for championships again until the 2010-2011 season. That was when one of the most famous super teams in NBA history took shape. The Big Three Heat of Wade, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh took the basketball world by storm and had championship expectations immediately thrust upon them. Although they got off to a slow start in the regular season, they eventually hit their stride and made it all the way to the 2011 NBA Finals in their first year together as teammates. Now you all know what happened in those 2011 Finals. Dirk Nowitzki and the Dallas Mavericks shockingly upset the Big Three Heat, while LeBron James had one of the worst playoff series of his entire career. But here's the thing, guess who was easily the best player on the court during that series? It obviously wasn't LeBron, and regardless of the fact that he was the Finals MVP, it wasn't Dirk Nowitzki either. The player who stood out with the best individual numbers was clearly Dwayne Wade. And if LeBron James had just had a regular performance by his standards, then Dwayne Wade would have 4 rings and 2 Finals MVPs in his career, rather than 3 and 1. This was the only season where it was a debate on whether this was Wade's team or LeBron's. After that, the Heat went on to win 2 championships in the next 3 years, as they made it all the way to the NBA Finals in all 4 years of the Big Three Heat's existence. Although Wade played a part in the franchise record 27-game winning streak, and although he won 2 championships as a teammate of LeBron, there was no question that Wade was the second best player on the team at that point in his career. After LeBron James left in free agency to return to Cleveland, Wade was able to remain somewhat competitive, as he was about a 20 points per game scorer for 3 seasons afterwards. But at that point, it was rather clear that Wade's top 10 player days were long behind him. and in 2019, at the age of 37, he decided to call it quits, retiring comfortably as one of the greatest two guards that the league has ever seen. In the totality of his career, he was a 3-time NBA champion, the 2006 Finals MVP, a 13-time All-Star, he made 8 All-NBA teams, 3 All-Defense teams, was the 2009 scoring champion, and is one of the 75 greatest players of all time. So in conclusion, just how good was Dwayne Wade really? Well, if I'm being honest, I feel like Wade had a bit of a weird career. Arguably, the very peak of his career happened in only his 3rd season, and I really felt like his prime didn't last very long, because throughout his mid to late 20s, he was on and off of the basketball court with some serious career-altering injuries. With that being said, I definitely don't agree with Wade that he would have been in the GOAT conversation without the injuries. I think that's a bit too much. But at the very least, maybe the gap between him and Kobe wouldn't be as significant. Regardless, he's easily my choice as the 3rd greatest shooting guard of all time. And the recent comparisons to James Harden are straight up disrespectful. Wade is clearly out of Harden's league, simply because postseason performances matter, and this thing called defense exists. One thing I've noticed throughout my years of watching the NBA is that the offensive side of the court is disproportionately celebrated over the defensive end of the court. And I don't believe that any single player is a greater example of that than the all-time great defender, Ben Wallace. But just how good was he really? In a perfect world, how much would he be celebrated? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, but in order to get a more thorough understanding of him, we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. The 6'9" Wallace attended college at Virginia Union University, and actually went undrafted in the 1996 NBA draft. But within a matter of a few years, all 29 NBA teams would be regretting that decision. Wallace was eventually picked up by a mediocre Washington Bullets team, who was in need of some help in the painted area. In his rookie season, he hardly got any opportunities, as he only played 34 games and averaged about 6 minutes of action per game. Washington at least liked him enough to bring him back for a 2nd and 3rd season, and although he did see some progression, it remained slow going. By his 3rd season with the team, he was averaging nearly 27 minutes per game, and although he was usually coming off the bench, he still managed to average about 6 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game on 58% shooting. After Washington had missed the playoffs for 3 straight seasons, management was ready to shake things up. So in August of 1999, he was traded to the Orlando Magic. He would start in all 81 games he played that season, but he actually played a fewer 24.2 minutes per game, and had somewhat similar numbers to the previous season. With some remaining limitations on him, Orlando finished with an underwhelming 41-41 record and missed the playoffs. Orlando then decided to make their own big changes. After signing Tracy McGrady to a massive contract, they decided to get him a co-star and traded for the 6'8" All-Star forward Grant Hill. It was this trade for Hill that sent Ben Wallace to the Detroit Pistons, where his legendary career would truly begin. At the time, people were considering this a one-sided trade in favor of the Magic, since McGrady and Hill were seen as a superstar duo who could compete for championships in the Eastern Conference. Well, that wasn't exactly the case, because not only did Hill go on to deal with consistent injuries, but Wallace went on to be much better than Orlando ever imagined. Although Detroit didn't have the overall talent to be a playoff contender just yet, Wallace was more than ready to assert himself as a terrific asset in the league. He started all 80 games he played in the regular season and averaged a career high up to that point 34.5 minutes per game. On the year, he averaged 6.4 points, 13.2 rebounds, 1.3 steals, and 2.3 blocks on 49% shooting. Immediately as a Piston, he established himself as one of the best rebounders and best defensive players in the entire league. With his remarkable strength and athleticism, he really was like a modern Bill Russell, in the sense that he was a team-first player who dominated the boards and the paint defensively, yet he was not a great scorer by any means. Although he was now on the basketball map in a big way, it wasn't all positive. For example, that first season in Detroit, he shot a historically awful 33.6% from the free throw line. In fact, for his career, Wallace only shot 41.4%. That is literally the worst career free throw percentage in NBA history, and it's not even close. To emphasize just how bad that actually is, consider this. Shaquille O'Neal is basically famous for his horrific free throw shooting. Well, he could come out of retirement and shoot 3,000 more free throws and miss every single one of them, and he would still have a better career free throw percentage than Ben Wallace. Yes, Wallace was a master defensively, but you kind of need to be if you're gonna justify having a roster spot with that kind of foul shooting. In the following season, he would finally have some offensive support, and his Pistons started winning games. Along with that, Wallace led the entire league for the 01-02 season in rebounds per game and blocks per game. Thanks to this incredible effort, he was honored with an all-defensive selection, and he won his first Defensive Player of the Year award, which would soon become a regular occurrence in his career. Now imagine playing 80 games in a season, averaging a league-leading 13 rebounds and 3.5 blocks, winning the Defensive Player of the Year award while your team wins 50 games in the regular season, which was enough to earn the second seed, and you're still not selected as an NBA All-Star that year. If that doesn't tell you that defense isn't appreciated as much as offense, then I don't know what will. Now, in his third season in Detroit is when their incredible championship team finally started to take shape, as they acquired both Chauncey Billups and Richard Hamilton, giving Wallace the offensive support he needed for him to truly shine. For the second straight season, he led the league in rebounds, this time with a monstrous 15.4 per game, which was the highest league-leading average since Dennis Rodman in 1997. On top of that, Wallace averaged 3.2 blocks and 1.4 steals, which helped him win his second straight Defensive Player of the Year award. Finally, he was respected enough to be given an All-Star selection, which was the very first of his career. His Pistons went all the way to the 2003 Eastern Conference Finals before they were swept in 4 games by Jason Kidd and the New Jersey Nets. After acquiring the experienced veteran Rasheed Wallace, the all-time great Pistons were set for their epic run. The 2003-2004 season was supposed to be the year of the super team Lakers, led by Shaq, Kobe, Karl Malone, and Gary Payton. But Detroit had something else in mind. As the defensive anchor down low, Wallace set the tone for that team, and that squad went on to be arguably the greatest defensive team in the history of pro basketball. The amount of defensive records they broke in the regular season, and especially the postseason, was utterly astonishing, including the most times holding a team under 90 points, 85 points, 80 points, 75, 70, 65, and 60. They held teams to the lowest points per game average in playoff history, and they had the best defensive rating in playoff history as well. Honestly, I could probably make an entire video about the all-defensive records they broke that season, and the player who was most responsible for that defense was none other than Big Ben. The 2004 Lakers were good enough to be a championship team on most seasons, but this year they ran into the defensive juggernaut that was the Pistons. Although Shaquille O'Neal had a decent final series, averaging 26.6 points per game, that was still far less than what he usually produced in the finals, and the credit for that belonged mostly to Wallace, who was one of the few players in basketball history who was actually as strong as the Diesel, which meant that Shaq couldn't just bully him as much as he wanted to. Not only did the Pistons go on to win that championship series, but they did it in dominating fashion, closing out the super team Lakers in just 5 games. Obviously, this was the absolute pinnacle of Wallace's career, but he was far from done adding to his resume. In his next 2 seasons, he would win the Defensive Player of the Year award yet again, which meant that he won the award a whopping 4 times in just 5 years. His 4 DPOYs is tied for the most in NBA history, alongside of the great Dikembe Mutombo. After starting his career struggling to make the playoffs in few minutes of action, he went on to be a perennial winner with the Detroit Pistons, as he made the Eastern Conference Finals in 4 straight seasons, including 2 trips to the NBA Finals in 2004 and 2005. As his strength and athleticism started to deteriorate with age, so did his defensive impact. And because of that, he ended his career as somewhat of a journeyman, playing in Chicago, Cleveland, and eventually he made his return to Detroit, before eventually retiring at the age of 37. In total, he was a 4-time All-Star, but that was far fewer than what he actually deserved. He made 5 All-NBA teams, 6 All-Defense teams, was a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, a 2-time rebounds leader, a 1-time blocks leader, and the 2004 NBA champion. Although he was certainly the epitome of a free throw liability, he was also one of the select few greatest defensive players of all time. And honestly, I think he's one of the most underappreciated players of all time, considering how he only made 4 All-Star teams, and considering how long it took for him to go into the Basketball Hall of Fame.
You hear it over and over again. Jerry West, the logo, Mr. Clutch. But does anybody ever stop and ask just how good was this man really in order to become the logo? With this video, we're delving into that. Now, Jerry West is probably the overall greatest NBA employee the league has ever had, especially when you consider all the different aspects of his career. He was an all-time great player, he coached the Lakers back into relevance in his short coaching career, he's one of the greatest scouters and analyzers of talent the league has ever seen, and he's possibly the best executive ever, as he's proven himself over and over again as a championship builder for multiple franchises. The thing is, out of all these things in his impressive resume, his playing career is the one that's the most distant in the past, and I think that's the reason his greatness is sometimes overlooked, or at least not appreciated as much as it should be. Let's change that injustice by marveling at his greatness, starting from the beginning of his career. Jerry West was drafted in 1960 with the 2nd overall pick by the Los Angeles Lakers. He was entering the league as a 6'2 to 6'4 point guard who had a very fundamentally sound game, and was both a great shooter and facilitator. At the time, Elgin Baylor was the clear leader of the team, averaging nearly 35 points a game. But in West's rookie season, he had an immediate impact in a supporting role, averaging 17.6 points, 7.7 rebounds, and 4.2 assists on 42% shooting. This was hardly a glimpse into what this man would become, because in terms of scoring and efficiency, they were well below the numbers he would become accustomed to. In his sophomore season in the league, he would have his chance to break out as a superstar, as Elgin Baylor spent much of his time that year serving in the military, missing roughly half the games that year. With Elgin often unavailable, West had to take more of a leadership role and a greater portion of the team's offense. And even as a 23-year-old in only his 2nd year, West did a remarkable job, averaging 30.8 points, 7.9 rebounds, and 5.4 assists on 44.5% shooting. If the Most Improved Player award had been a thing during that year in history, then Jerry almost certainly would have won it. With the 1-2 punch of West and Baylor firmly established, they both earned nicknames that complemented one another's game, given by the great Laker commentator Chick Hearn. Baylor was known as Mr. Inside, emphasizing his strong rebounding ability and low post scoring, while West was known as Mr. Outside because of his ability to facilitate from the perimeter and consistently knock down shots from a great distance. With that dynamic duo, they made it to the NBA Finals in only West's 2nd season, and pushed a far more talented Boston Celtics team to a 7th game before ultimately coming up short. This year in the finals, the Celtics were loaded with all-time greats like Bill Russell, Bob Cousy, Tommy Heinsohn, and Sam Jones. This coming up short to the loaded Celtics was a theme of Jerry's career, and honestly, just a theme of any team that played in the 1960s. We've talked about this in several past videos, but the Celtics were a stacked team with Hall of Famers during that era, and free agency did not exist in the 1960s, which essentially means that there was almost no player movement around the league at the time, which also means the Celtics stayed stacked for many years. And there was little other teams around the league could do to change the enormous gap in talent between them and Boston. It's arguably the biggest contributing factor into why the Celtics won 8 straight championships in the 60s. That and because Bill Russell is a badass and deserves a lot of credit for it. The reason why I'm explaining this is because Jerry West went to the finals 9 times, and only won it all once. How is it that a man that's known as Mr. Clutch is also 1-8 in the NBA Finals? It's because the lack of free agency and player freedom that the 1960s, more so than any other era of NBA history, was a time where players stayed put with their franchises. I wouldn't say that they were more loyal to their teams during that era. They were trapped. Jerry West was almost always clutch down the stretch and a big game performer, regardless of the fact that his losses were often at the hands of a team with plenty of all-stars. Jerry averaged 27 points per game over his career, but in the playoffs, he raised his game and scored 29.1 points per game, which is the 3rd highest playoff scoring average in NBA history. The playoffs are where games slow down and where more elite defense is represented. So more often than not, players average less points in the playoffs. But then there are guys like Jordan, LeBron, Kobe, and Jerry West, who gave even more production when it mattered most. Staying on the clutch thing for a minute, but to go along with the numerous game winners over his career, Jerry had some of the most ridiculous playoff runs of all time. Like in 1965, where West averaged a stupid 40.6 points per game over the entirety of the 1965 playoffs. 40.6. That's the 2nd highest single-season playoff average of all time. Only Michael Jordan has one greater at 43.6. But I would argue that Jordan's shouldn't even count, since MJ did his in only a 3-game series when they were swept by the Celtics. The Logo did his in 11 games that ended in the NBA Finals. 11 games to 3. Jerry's is clearly more impressive. He also had one of the greatest NBA Finals ever in the 1969 season. So just how much did he stand out in that series? Well, enough to be the only Finals MVP in NBA history to win the award on the losing team. In that epic 7-game series, he averaged 37.9 points, 7.4 assists, and 4.7 rebounds on 49% shooting. He nearly carried his Lakers to beat that Celtics team, as the Lakers' next best contributor offensively was Elgin Baylor, who averaged less than 20 points per game over that series and shot under 40% from the field. In the first game of that series, West set the tone and scored 43 points in a 2-point victory. In the final and deciding game of that series, West dropped 42 points in a 2-point loss. With even just a tiny bit more help, Jerry's legendary performance would have earned him another championship. Jerry could also beat you in multiple ways. In 1970, he led the league in scoring with 31.2 points per game. And just 2 years later, he led the league in assists with 9.7 per game. Jerry was a consistent force, as he played a total of 14 years in the league and was named an All-Star every single one of those years. He also made 12 All-NBA teams. Something I almost never hear mentioned is how great of a defender he was as well. The Logo made 5 All-Defense teams in his career, which sounds great enough and impressive within itself. But then you realize the NBA was only doing all-defense teams since 1969. That means that Jerry was only eligible for that award 6 years of his career, and he earned the selection 5 of those seasons. There were 8 incredible years of his career before that honor even existed. Not only that, but those 5 years he was eligible and made the all-defense team were from the age of 30 to 35. That is typically a time when NBA players are past their prime, they're slowing down, and don't stand out as much defensively. But clearly, Jerry West was an exception. Steals and blocks were not accounted for in those days, but if you asked anyone who saw West play, they'll tell you about his defensive prowess. In his playing days, the three-point line did not exist in the NBA yet, and Jerry West was yet another great who could have greatly benefited from the three-point line. As we mentioned earlier, one of his numerous nicknames was Mr. Outside, because of his ability to hit perimeter shots at a remarkably efficient rate. Let's ponder this. He has the 5th highest scoring average in NBA history and the 3rd highest in playoff history as a 6'2" perimeter shooting guard with no three-point line. Imagine if he had a three-point line. What would his numbers have looked like then? For his career, he averaged 27 points, 6.7 assists, and 5.8 rebounds on a remarkable 47.4% shooting. At first glance, you might not think 47.4% is all-time great efficiency, but for a 6'2" player who scores like he does, yeah, that's mind-blowing how good that is. If you look at the list of the highest scoring averages in NBA history, and look to find a player who was Jerry West's size or smaller who shot as efficiently as Jerry did, you would have to go all the way down from west of the 5th spot to the 122nd spot, where Calvin Murphy averaged 17.9 points on 48.2% shooting. That means the nearest comparable player to West in terms of stature and efficiency averaged almost 10 points less per game over his career than Jerry West did. That is astonishing. Now, I should add that Jerry West has stated that he's a bit taller than his so-called official listing. Even if you list him at, say, 6'4", you still have to go pretty far down the list. The point remains the same regardless. To average as much as he did, as efficiently as he did, at his stature, is unheard of. The season that stands out the most from Jerry's career from a team perspective is the 71-72 season. That's the year he led the league in assists while putting up 25.8 points per game, while the Lakers won an NBA record 33 straight games. And of course, they went on to be NBA champions that year, beating the Knicks comfortably in 5 games. Simply put, the man is one of a kind, and as you dig deeper into his greatness, it makes total sense why they made him the logo.